All right. All right. No, not running. Why are you not kicking up audio? There we go. You're kicking up audio. Good. Sorry about that, everyone. It's going to take as long as it takes to get this thing running sometimes. It's just a fun fucking process. My camera stopped working, so reboot it is. But I know you're not here necessarily for me. You don't even care necessarily for me, which I don't blame you for at all. You're here for Anti-Oedipus. Let's get that moving when I can. Where did you go? Where's my setup? Come on. Come on. It's not letting me sign into chat. That's fine. Who cares? I don't give a shit. No one cares. No one gives a shit. No one gives a fuck. That's fine. No one cares. Let's get these things in the right positions. Why is this different than it was last week? It was fucking broken for some reason. That's fine. If you're talking in chat, I can't read you. I'm going to be joining the Discord in just a moment. Because everyone in Discord is probably pinging me and being like, where the fuck are you, Brooks? Everyone in Discord is probably like, where the fuck are you, Brooks? And the answer is trying to get his stupid OBS running, which is perfectly fine.
We will wait until we will wait.
You will wait.
I'm
That's right. You
excited.
will wait. You're going to be waiting. That's right. That's right. God. We get that going. Let me make sure. How happy is that? So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today at the Decoded Quarantine Collective. But we are slowly making our way, slowly but surely, through the final bits before we move on to chat. As I do, we only have a little bit left of. Um, Anti-Oedipus. Yes. OBS is time. The way we're setting up for this, talking about these things, the way that Anti-Oedipus builds into Oedipus, has been throughout the entire book about kind of getting to this point where we understand why Oedipus as an idea or this prohibition of incest, how this operates, how this space of representation is by, how the Oedipal system works, how capitalism works, representation in the nuclear family to produce. That it isn't a thing that simply exists tautologically, is formed and is containing many, many people through. When we sort of left off last week, and I'm going to reread, we're going to reread. We make our way smartly into. But what we're talking about ultimately, the actual shift of desire, and how it's able to find its object of desire. What is it doing? What is it aiming at? What is it doing? It doesn't have really a goal. It doesn't have a thing. But instead, it is um, it is built uniquely And we don't just have the simple trick of desire being tricked. It isn't simply a matter of ideology. That it's a matter of direct social and all of this. But we're going to start reading and just make our way through this. We're actually going to finish off all of Discord. Feel going. Hope Rivals is fun. But with that, we're going to go ahead and read. We're going to start on page 266, Oedipus at, because we're going to reiterate and come back to all of these things and just it works. We've got to be repetitive. Got to keep. Soundgate might be too set up. That's fair. We'll lower that. Yeah, that seems like. I had it really. What the fuck? I had it really, really fine. Okay, much better. Doesn't matter. We're starting over. We're going to be going through 266 on the left here, Oedipus at last. And let's make our way through it. Follow along, ask questions. Let's do this. Oedipus at last. In the end, it is a very simple opera. One that indeed readily lends itself to formalization, although it involves universal history. We have seen in what sense schizophrenia was the absolute limit of every society, inasmuch as it sets in motion decoded and deterritorialized flux that it restores to desiring production, at the bounds of all social production. And capitalism, the relative limit of every society, inasmuch as it axiomatizes the decoded flux and reterritorializes the deterritorialized. We have seen that capitalism finds in schizophrenia its own exterior limit, which it is continually repelling and exorcising, while capitalism itself produces its immanent limits, which it never ceases to displace and enlarge. But capitalism still needs a displaced interior limit in another way, precisely in order to repel or neutralize the absolute exterior limit, the schizophrenic limit. It needs to internalize this limit, this time by restricting it, by causing it to pass no longer between social production and the desiring production that breaks away from social reproduction, but inside social production, between the form of social reproduction, the form of familial reproduction, which social production is reduced, between the social aggregate and the private sub-aggregate to which the social aggregate is applied. Let's talk through what all of these different things mean, because it is a metric ton of, some people call jargon I've seen. When we talk about the limits of society, talk about the interior exterior limits. There's a reason they're using this topology. In 1,000 Plateaus, they're going to really, really expand on sort of the way to think of these things in terms of limits or interior. When we talk about an absolute limit of every system, there is the sense that schizophrenia, as they were talking about, the automatonistic, the completely dissociated, unsocial, broken off. This is the absolute limit of every society. That the inability to have any connections at all form. The absolute limit of every society. Easy enough. And the way that it works with this is it sets in motion decoded and deterritorialized flux it restores to desiring production. Instead of having the social connections at large, desire is sort of returned to its, I don't want to say in natural state, it's the wrong framing for this. But the way that they phrase it, I think, works. It restores these things to desiring production instead of codes, the coded world, codes as they were, the setup there. This is the absolute. And capitalism, as we know it, is the relative limit of every society. It axiomatizes the decoded flux, reterritorializes the territorialized flux. In capitalism, capitalism's happy to have things become completely deterritorialized. Schizophrenia effectively does this. The way that the parts of what it means to be a blacksmith, or it means to be a coder, or it means to be an artist. These elements that seem to be coded or set in stone become broken apart. We learn of the different pieces of the parts of it, the different pieces of the machine. And these pieces of the machine, capitalism's happy to have broken apart because it introduces an efficiency, it allows more profit, it allows for extraction of profits, things like that. Plus, it allows just for meaning to break apart and the new to be. This is the breakdown of things. Capitalism finds in schizophrenia its own exterior limit. It's continually repelling and exercising. Capitalism can't do with no social connection. It's its own exterior limit. Capitalism also has the same, basically, absolute limit and exterior limit. Capitalism's right up against that. And it's got to continually push back that limit. It's got to continually find ways to recapture desire, to not allow it to just flow free or side of it. While capitalism itself produces its imminent limit, which it never ceases to displace, large. The production cycle of things, the material is turned into material for other things, commodities, which then are used in other commodities for production, but as something, as sort of that, the pulse of that going out, setup of that, the aggregate worth of that gets pushed out. There is within capital its own need to sort of pull back on those. Say, wait, we can't simply allow the freeing of all of this. We have to fall back on it and claim it as the interior limit. It neutralizes or repels that limit, the schizophrenic limit, internalizes it by restricting it to pass not between social production and desire production, but within social production, form of social production and familial production. Then desire to social, it's familial to social. This is the setup they're playing with. It is basically recapitulating the entirety of chapter 3. Don't really have the ability to go back and revisit that. Happy to if we want to take a moment, but that's basically what's happening here. They're recapitulating almost all of chapter 3 and summarizing. Marcellus, I saw you unmute.
Okay. So this oscillation between social production and desire production, right? And can we say that like social production is within desire and production, right? And this oscillation happening, this chiasmatic, that's the word, oscillation that is going back and forth like a flux, right? And produce its own limit. It's kind of like capital produce its own limit and construct desire and production, right? But at the same time, this limit, in a weird Hegelian way, this limit, or Deleuzian way, this limit is actually a new beginning, right? It's a new kind of freeing of capital, right? From its limit itself, right? From the limit itself, right? So, yeah. So my question is that, like, the limit. So is that limit the internalized, like, it need to internalize this limit, right? Is that internalization of limit within social production and desire and production, is that a new way to kind of like set out a new beginning of capital, right?
Well,
Within desire and
it's
production.
changing where the beginning is. So the human condition in prehistory, without like all of that, desire and the filiative line, the germinative filiative line, as they I have kids. I have kids based on a whole bunch of reasons. With whom I have kids is a whole bunch of reasons. Large complexity, right? So when I'm doing this thing, there's a bunch of desire is almost directly interacting with the social field. Capital is different because the way that the family exists, the family is like a privatized social institution, but capital is where the filiative line is sort of set up. So we have this really odd sort of extraction of the germinative, creative line that's being sort of moved from the family to capital. And so when we talk about the interior limits or the setup, capital doesn't flow from child to parent. Capital flows from family maybe breadwinners, whatever you want to call it, through society. So we're talking about the familial capital to capital interests at large, even no matter who you may be. Paychecks come in or capital interests come in, or capitalist family, dividends, whatever it is. That's the family as a thing to the rest of everything else, rather than the family being sort of integrated or at one with the social field. We've separated it out and it's become its own little sort of singular element. So we have this odd change inside of that. That's kind of what they're referring. As I understand it, and this is the fun language where I'm very open to having these larger conversations about it, because it is, they step over their own language a few times here. And I do think they're intending to be more complex and sort of speak to something that's a little bit, but this is the setup. When we have new productive forces, because the schizophrenic limits of capital, or capital itself, has decoded and broken things down. So we have new elements that are there. Capital happily reterritorializes this decoded desire and basically actualizes it in terms of its power of capital. To quote Holland, the retrograde force that hinders development of new productive forces and, more importantly, prevents the expenditure of surplus for purposes other than reinvestment in further surplus production. Well, deterritorialization as the economic component is the constant revolutionizing of the means of production. The constant changing that generates change itself frees energies of production and consumption. These elements are kind of two moments of a single process. This process does not happen in desiring production at all anymore. Fully axiomatized, fully social. And so it exists between the family as a unit, again, singular, and then everything inside of that is private, and the way that it sort of plays into. Does that make sense? I'm saying it?
Yeah, basically the finite become the quantity become a quality. Basically, the finite become infinite. Kind of like that. I don't
Yeah,
know, but
the
like,
within the family itself, because it becomes a singular unit, the family itself becomes a training ground for the asceticism that capital wants us all to have, or that we all need to have, that we need to accept this position, that we need to see the world a certain way and have very particular social investments. Quote, just as capital separates the worker from the means of life and defers gratification until after work, payday, retirement, the father separates the child from a nurturing mother and defers gratification until maturity and the founding of a new family. Your rewards will come in time. You, in time, doing the right things, will find someone to fuck, rather than, again, direct investments in the social field.
mm,
And it's that direct investment in the social field that there was in the first socius, that was, again, still sort of there even in the second, despite the sort of unbridled political terror and power that exists in that. But by adding an economic factor, we move desire and desiring production sort of out of that realm, or desire out of the realm of the sort of actual desiring production. Instead, the social exists almost purely in a representational space. To quote,
mm,
if social rules under capitalism are already images of economic functions, as said, family rules are then images of these images, derivatives of derivatives. Capitalist subjects are trained in asceticism by an institution isolated from social repression, yet reproduces capitalist social structure and dynamics in their most abstract terms. Structure of capital is visited within the family, and it's not that a dad says, now let's role play, I'm your boss, blah, blah, but instead, the way that we interact with power, the way that we interact with pleasure, the way that we interact with kindness, caution, any of these things, our parents become those elements. We can find them replicated because of how it's structured, and representation sort of takes off. This is the axiomatization process. This is where Oedipus really shows its face fully.
mm, yeah, it's a Humean kind
Not
of,
far.
I don't know.
It's not
It's a
far.
Humean kind. Yeah, it's not far. Yeah,
It's
it's
not
kind of
far.
like the
I mean,
representation. Yeah, it's kind of like Brooks, the representation. Like you have bunch of triangles, right? Like that like their two angles equal the third. right? And Hume, like with discussion with Berkeley, like he equated to Berkeley this discovery that our representation is a kind of a single kind of fixated in our experience. Basically it's a single, like fixated upon a triangle, a one, you know. For example, when Hume said like you know the two angles of a triangle equal to the third, that's like, that's, yeah, that I believe in that, but as a representation, as a particular representation. So Hume believed that, you know, you have a particular representation that represent a general. We make these general by our experiences, right? So when you encounter like a triangle that different to your representation, right? A triangle that is like have the same kind of images, but like doesn't have the same kind of images, but like it's different from your representation. It's kind of, you equate it like you kind of have this resemblance that is kind of, this triangle is different from your representation, from your particular representation that you receive it from your impression, right? So it's kind of like Humean like way, you know. He put it like lightly, you know, in a Humean way, in a particular representation which represent a general one, right? We do that in human nature. This is part of the human nature. We do that because we want to avoid like nonsense upon speaking of like about government, about things, right? We do these like kind of particular representation that are, we think that they are not particular, but they are actually particular. But we represent them as general, right? Representation, right? It's kind of like that. Put it like that.
Well, and this becomes where we see the paralogism of displacement. This is the critique of representation showing up because of, again, the structures aren't really structures, not in the sense of, oh, I see my father everywhere thing, but instead the general sort of interaction and progression, programmatic nature of that relationship over time instills in me that the person who is, you know, in charge of things, who wins the money, right? Again, traditional nuclear family, but this can work. It doesn't matter if it's traditional or not. But one is the lawgiver, the one I have to listen to. My obedience is important. Mother being the one who, very young, fed or cared or was nurturing. But then as I grew up, I had to learn I had to separate from there. I have to give up on those things, my security, my safety, those things. And then ultimately, as a position of desire, the opposite sex parent becomes someone that I'm not allowed to have. And but again, these are interactions that then get displaced elsewhere. And this is that first setup that happens. This is as just to read through again, Holland, what they call the repressing representation is one thing. It is the signifier of the prohibition. For example, incest, signifier. Oedipus. This signifier entails or generates a corresponding signified. So the signifier and signified. Normal relationship. This is the referent, however, which Deleuze and Guattari refer to as the repressed representative, is something else. Desire itself, in the form it takes, operating beneath the prohibitive system of representation in a given mode of social production. What really gets repressed by this prohibition against incest is actually completely different from the false image of it produced by prohibition. Desire gets displaced onto an erroneous signifier belonging to the prohibitive system of representation rather than desire itself. The desire wants to eat something or wants to grab a pan, for example, just want to grab a hot pan off the stove, want to touch fire, want to grab hot coal. These are things that pretty much immediately, as a thing, you will find out like bad. Like, don't do that shit. But this desire, kind of almost understand it, can respond to this because it's very direct and simplified. Don't do that. That will hurt. This is bad. There's repression that gets produced from that. That's emotional, direct, and simplified. When we have this complex system of relationships now, like, no, we have a prohibited, you're not allowed to do incest. Don't do those things. Not so much that suddenly, oh, well, desire wants mom or wants sex with mom. No, desire doesn't understand sex with mom or dad or sister or anyone else. That's not really what desire does. That's an intellectualized thing. It's more complicated. That's this sort of bigger thing. Desire now sort of attaches to this sort of referent, this emotional third thing, displaced into this erroneous signified that belongs to representation. Incest being prohibited, desire now is prohibited from that, but not repressed, not really, because it doesn't have a direct experience. It didn't learn, I guess you could say it didn't learn firsthand. It doesn't have these things. This is what capital is set up to do. This is what the family does. We teach, no, that's forbidden, not for any real reason, just because we say so and trust us. That thing then shifts this and creates this odd interaction, which traps desire in this odd, fucked up triangle that Oedipus ultimately builds, that we then see everywhere. Things that aren't directly said, that don't directly deal with desire, that because desire doesn't know mom from dad from a pillow. It doesn't know these things. Those are intellectualized. So this setup, to just read Holland, as basic as this first capital mistake is to psychoanalysis, however, the mechanism of displacement does not by itself distinguish Oedipus from other desire. To do this, we need to examine its relations to other misunderstandings. And this is the rest of the setup that they're also dealing with, is like, that's what this paragraph is kind of going over at large. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's actually makes sense. Actually,
good.
like illuminating.
Good. Yay. Happy day. All right. So as we're going through this, when we talk about Oedipus right now, we're really talking about those three steps that desire prohibited, signified signifier, relationship, and referent created. The three things. And this setup creates an internalized limit. Desire won't pass. Why won't it pass? That doesn't really know. Like, but it's, don't do that. And it's not just with incest, but really, really great example of it. The next paragraph, let's stop. Oedipus is this displaced or internalized limit where desire lets itself be caught. The Oedipal triangle is the personal and private territoriality that corresponds to all of capitalism's efforts at social reterritorialization. Pausing there for a moment. Remember, capitalism doesn't have social codes, but we also can't have completely unbridled desire socially. Society will not allow such a thing. So this is where capitalism reterritorializes the social. Unpausing. Oedipus was always the displaced limit for every social formation, since it is the displaced represented of desire. But in the primitive formations, this limit remains vacant, precisely insofar as the flux are coded, and as the interplay of alliances and filiations keep families extended according to the scale of the determinations of social, preventing any secondary reduction of the latter former. Again, primitive social fields, one, no nuclear family that was like deeply private, extended families. You kind of had aunts and uncles you lived with, mom and dad did a whole bunch of stuff. You didn't really even have mom and dad. They didn't talk about it. We do. You might have mom, have three women you call that, or an aunt that plays mom because mom can't. All of these things, this oddness sort of stops everything from being collapsed to this simple thing, because there's so much complexity in the coding of all. In the despotic formation, the Oedipal limit is occupied, symbolically occupied, but not lived or inhabited, inasmuch as the imperial incest affects an overcoding, in turn surveys the entire social from above, the repressing representation. The formal operations of flattening, extrapolation, and so on that later belonged to Oedipus are already sketched out, but within a symbolic space. The object from on high is formed. When we've talked about the despotic, the king is the thing that matters. Hard to consider this, but it's like I said last week, the king is what matters, but not the king. I have the phrase, the king is dead, long live the king. king person doesn't matter. The body of the king is, who gives a shit? Full body of the king was the place that he positioned, that he holds, the symbolic space. That is occupied, not lived in. The king doesn't fart and shit and do all these things. We don't think about that. Now, again, the jokes people tell about kings making jokes about how they don't shit, or that is, these aren't jokes. People didn't consider them people. The people didn't matter. Position did. Position is lived in. It's symbolic position. Everyone following so far? We're about to get to the big one. Okay, we're about to get to capital, so we'll make our way back through it. Don't worry, cowboy. It is only in the capitalist formation that the Oedipal limit finds itself not only occupied, but inhabited and lived in the sense in which the social images produced by this decoded flux actually fall back on restricted familial images invested by desire. Your dad's a person. The dad is a position. Both. But he's lived. You know the dude. He's like right there. Or mom, or two moms. I don't give a fuck. Traditional, non-traditional. That person is a lived thing, but also a position, symbolically. Father, your mother, me, mommy, daddy, me, is a position that I can talk. I can say, oh, my old man was a tough one. That's an easy thing to, everyone kind of, oh, your old man. They don't mean, I don't mean Randy Brown, my old man. That both works as both, which is kind of fucked up. And that's the big deal here. That Oedipal limit finds itself not only occupied, also inhabited and lived in the sense in which social images produced by the decoded flux fall back on restricted familial images invested by desire. Desires invested in those images. Lo and behold, the social production of what those images mean falls back on them, and thus we have this odd interaction in capital that produces the placed represented. Right? Hope you get it. But anyway, continue. And I should finish the paragraph. It is at this point in the imaginary that Oedipus is constituted at the same time as it completes its migration in the in-depth elements of representation. The displaced represented has become, as such, the representation of desire. The big sentence, pausing again. When we talk about desire, I did a video on this. You'll hear people, they talk about their wants. The displaced image of desire is what they're talking about here. We have an image of desire now. Displaced, it's, oh, I want that. I feel I want that. I want that. I'm able to give voice to it. I'm able to say it is that thing because these positions now lived. I'm able to see this is all that referent. In that odd interaction, I now have the ability to give it voice. This is not desire. This is not that. This is the displaced represented is now the representation of desire. Hence it goes without saying that this becoming or this constitution does not develop under the categories imagined in the earlier social form, since the imaginary Oedipus results from such a becoming and not the inverse. It is not a flux of shit or a wave of incest that Oedipus arrives, but via the decoded flux of capital money. The waves of incest and shit are only secondary derivatives of the latter, insofar as they transport private persons, which the flux of capital are reduced or applied. This is Klosowski's living currency. This is straight up from it. It has nothing to do with us being Oedipalized first, mommy first, or any of these things, or having these relations first. This comes from capital being actually labor. This is actually people's work being extracted, pulled out, and set up. That's actually the value where it's created. Now it's separated. It's built out. It's moving. It's doing all of these other fucking things. It is something else now. Capital is something else. These relations are now ordered by that. We've separated man from his labor abstract. That abstractness is moving around, and it allows the family to be privatized. All happens. We run into this. It says in the paragraphs, which explains the complex origin of the relation that is completely distorted in the psychoanalytic equation shit equals money. In reality, it is a question of encounters or conjunctions, of derivatives and resultants between decoded flux. This is
Uh, oh, what what Kautsky mean when he said decoded flux?
that's actually not.
Decoded.
When I say that's not actually Klosowski. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. That's not quoting. Not quoting Klosowski, but this is straight up talking about the idea of living currency, about the idea of the flux of capital reduced and applied to the transportation, the private person that everything is sort of set up for. That makes sense.
Mm. Mm. Decoded flux in money currency or in like in like I know that we talk about psychoanalytically, you know, equation, I guess, but like this you know, I didn't understand decoded flux. I don't know.
I know.
Uh,
Let's take a
I,
second and go through it then. The flux of desire bursts forth, connects, and that connection sparks forth other bursts that continue to move. This is sort of the emergent property of desire. Desire does this. We have arrangements of desire. Desire becomes arranged, and we recognize these arrangements. We call them things, and then we totalize them. So we have this odd thing where we have shit and money. In the old way of the world of psychoanalysis, shit and money go together. This old Freudian thing where basically as a child learns to shit, what they're learning is actually to control expulsion. They're learning to hold on or expel. They're controlling the flux of shit. Shit is money. If one can properly control themselves, if one can handle that type of control, general psychoanalytic thinking has always been that if you're properly potty trained, you know how to shit, you have control over impulses and expulsion of your own waste. This is why shit and money are sort of equated very often in psychoanalysis. But they're saying here, no, there's a complete distortion happening because instead, in reality, it's a question of encounters and conjunctions, derivatives and resultants between the decoded flux. Shit and money, it's not that if one controls shit, they control money. It's that the controlling of shit is actually like the teaching about properly controlling yourself, your anus, controlling yourself, holding back. That thing is actually the prerequisite for the creation of money. Not it's not the inverse where they're saying like, oh, if you do this, you
yeah,
get capital.
you making sense. You're making sense. Actually, Bill Gates actually he will do something that kind of reterritorialize capital by kind of doing a kind of a project. I have you heard of Bill Gates doing kind of using transforming shit to kind of water? Have you heard
I am
about Bill
unfamiliar
Gates?
with that.
Yeah, read. It's an interesting. It's kind of 5 years ago, the article, but he kind of. I heard about it like 5 years ago. It's been a while, but like he kind of like transforming. He want to do a project, maybe in other country, not the United States, but he want to do a project where he transforms shit to a water. So that's kind of Deleuze here anticipates something like it's exciting, like this passage is exciting, like connecting psychoanalysis with this. It's very exciting. It's mean that even cheating is labor, right? Even
Mm-hmm.
cheating is labor, right? Like, do you imagine that Bill Gates, right? Once a while, like, oh, we kind of did a social production, right? Where we transform, well, like he actually talked about it in the media. He want to transform shit to water, right? Actually where people like kind of labor for like kind of cheating. I'm sorry for this expression, but like kind of cheating to kind of transform water to Bill Gates to sell it like as a surplus value, right? Which is kind of crazy, right, Brooks? but like, yeah, it makes sense. Now
Well,
it
and
makes
it's
sense.
a thing that and it because I'll just like I've never heard of this. Well, one, good, because this is one of those things that even though you have heard of it, you just don't know it because it's not really considered as like, you know, mainline psychology. That this is where we get the term someone who has a type A personality or is anal retentive. The anal stage in psychoanalysis is the idea that a child at some point their erogenous zone of their anus becomes their focus. The expulsion or the control of shit becomes then their forming of independence. Am I able to learn to control this, or do I just drop shit wherever I go? Am I at whims of my body or not? And so the term type A, or the anal retentive person, is the idea of someone who is stingy with their money because they're overly fastidious, overly worried about expulsion, dirtiness, messiness, these things, because generally, again, I'm not saying this is the way it is. I'm saying this is what Freud be talking about. But like
Yeah.
if a parent comes in and is like, I don't know. I always think of the Family Guy line. Hey, we're teaching our son to poop, and they're at the bookstore, and he goes, "Oh, well, we have the very popular Everybody Poops." Oh, I'm sorry, we're Catholic. Oh, actually, we also have the book Nobody Poops Except You, and what's coming out of you is excreted pure evil, which I like as a joke. But it's parents who are like over particular. No, don't shit there. You're not allowed to shit there. Don't do this, and they become like type A kids. Anal expulsive, obviously the opposite. We usually don't use that term because anal expulsive sounds like a really good heavy metal band. But it's the opposite. It's someone who doesn't give a
Okay,
shit and is
I
sort of
I
explosive.
really want to kind of ask. So, are you making the link between the so-called money and the the potty training, shitting?
I
Are
am
you
not.
talking
I'm
about
saying what
this in a
Freud. I'm talking about what Freud said.
yeah, so what about it? Is it in the frame of when they're treating children, or are you talking about like in general that includes adults?
So Freud, when he was Freud, psychoanalysts across the board, when they're treating someone who turns out to be anal retentive or anal expulsive, they tend to spend their money or they're fastidious with their cash or type A. Money is associated with shit and self control and self
Okay,
liberation.
can you not use that phrase before you explain that phrase? Like, for example, if someone is really tight with the money, does that mean that they tend to be very what? Do they tend to be having problem when they go to the bathroom? Do they tend to have hemorrhoid in a surgical sense? Do
No,
they tend to have problem with potty training when they're earlier? I want like, can you make a little bit more clear connection here?
um, Freud would say that a person who is stingy with their money wasn't potty trained in line with rewards, but instead with punishment. And someone who is anally expulsive, who is frivolous with cash and give a shit, he would say was overindulged as a child when they were going potty training, led to their personality.
So that sounds like an either or.
Or, I mean, there's the third, which is someone who's healthy who would have neither of those traits.
And maybe a lot of times, maybe like, well, this is in adults because I haven't started with the children. What if adults, they are stingy in inappropriate ways that is in the harm of themselves while being wasteful
He would
of
probably
the thing
being
at the same
wasteful of
time?
what? How would they be wasteful and stingy? Sorry.
You can be wasteful and then stingy on money and spend it on different things.
Um,
Like
sure.
you can be stingy on the life, like necessary life supplies. For example, I don't know, toilet paper or food or water, and then be very wasteful on something that's very amorphous, like psychoanalysis that costs $200 per hour in the United States. If a person spend on both, what does that explanation go? Does that mean that there's a cancellation of each other, or is there something new there?
Oh no.
because that's where the social production comes in, right?
Not for Freud.
Yeah, I'm not talking about Freud. I'm not talking about
I
this
am.
article. Okay. So I'm just wondering, does that mean that this part of the article is talking about there is a social production placeholder while these things are happening? Or are these still just tracing back to the way that Freud was introducing these things?
Well, it's a parenthetical talking about how the original psychoanalytic equation shit equals money was completely distorted, and in reality, it's quite different. So, I mean, it's only one sentence in a parenthetical. That's what they're doing. Yeah, they're saying, isn't it funny? He said it was this way, but the reality is, it's not so much that control of shit yields money, but instead that the way that we sort of teach people early on how to handle erogenous zones and types of things comes instead is about the encounters and conjunctions, the derivatives and resultants between the decoded flux.
Okay.
Yeah, as Noah says, there's really not a social production placeholder thing. That's not really social production is happening. That's kind of their point, actually. For Freud, again, Freud was very hung up on how children are potty trained, how these things happen the first 5-6 years of life, their relationships with their parents, who comes in, those kind. But I'll let you and Noah in the comments go. What's up, Josh's?
So would a different way of phrasing that be that what makes it possible for Freud and other psychoanalysts to come up with this form of analysis in which their starting point, or what they think of as their starting point, is this analysis of the anal phase, as formative of what comes out of it later in life, right? That first you have this, the stage and what happens during this stage, and then it leads to, various, I don't know if you call them personality traits or personality, features with regard to such things as money. But what Freud fails to do is to recognize, to dig deeper, and to realize that what makes it possible for him to have his starting point is that his starting point is not really a starting point, and that's the distortion. That it's more of an effect of a more fundamental, if you want to call it starting point, which would, well, all right, so. Would that real starting point be something which is already, well, it would be involved with capital, certainly, right? With what capital, how capital makes sets the stage or organizes ways of thinking that make something like Freud's stage and anal stage possible. But that's already. But that's social, right? I mean it's capital is already a social process that is making possible this ostensibly private, anal stage. Is that all? Am I? Does that sound?
Yeah, it's to just read a little bit of Holland, because it is an interesting point to focus on for a moment, because it is that idea of the social that matters and how it's being produced. To quote, "If this last pacification of desire is indeed the most virulent and sinister of all, as I have suggested, it is because in one sense, desire now no longer knows what it wants. Material circumstances and repressing representations combine to offer desire the very familial objects that they simultaneously forbid. What is more, the death instinct, which first arose under despotism, becomes pervasive. Instead of hovering over everyone as a distant threat from the despot, death becomes imminent to everyday existence, harbors the omnipresent threat of having insufficient money to secure food or shelter. Threat, that is, of losing one's job and losing market access to means of life. Market-based form of the death instinct, like other elements of capitalism, is reflected and reinforced in the dynamics of the nuclear family, with parental love functioning as money. Since children are effectively isolated from other sources of nourishment and protection, if they forfeit parental love, they break the law of the father, in Lacan's words, and lose access to the mother, they will perish. Under both sets of conditions, the death instinct compels desire to become increasingly pacified and reactive. The point being, the structure is the thing. It's any of these specific points we can go over, but the structure is kind of the idea here. The family reproduces all the things that capitalism does in order to effectively create subjects like us who can exist very nicely inside of capitalism, because we're already sort of set up for that. We know we need to please mom and dad or else they'll put us out. Or if we lose them, dear God, that would be awful. We don't think we don't have options besides mom and dad. My son is 6 and he got really upset the other day and said he's leaving the family forever. And at 6 years old, they do this. And it's this really extravagant, large thing, which he didn't really mean. And it became a thing like, I didn't want to take him down that road, but what are his options? Like, really, what's he going to do? He's not going to like leave the house and find a house. That's not, for him, it might be possible, but not really a thing. So we live in a place where desire learns the edges of how far it can push. I don't want to say invisible edges because it's not based on representation, but they're places to invest where they can and where they can't, where repression has to be created, where things have to be held back, where I have to learn not to respond to specific places. This thing that I'm doing has to always be in line with mom and dad or sister or brother, but my house. And that thing then extrapolates, and I extrapolate it to the rest of society because it's all I knew until I was 15. Most of us, maybe even 12 in most places of the world. This is what happens. Desire, no longer able to invest directly socially, invests through the family, sort of, and then finds the family everywhere it goes. So when we talk about shit and money, their joke here is less important than the idea that the way that a parent teaches or what a parent does or how shit happens, like potty training is like the least fun thing that there is with a child, but like that thing, how do you do that? What does it set up? Well, these are encounters. These are actually desire finding its way out and having to teach. Well, you can't just shit on the ground. You can't just do these things. Why not? What are the setups? How do we teach? How do we position someone correctly? Actually, a really fun debate to have sometime. Not today, but we can have that sometime. Really weird discussion because it's how do we do it without recreating the capitalist subjectivity that fucks us in the first place, right? My question. So that's the debate, and that's kind of their point underneath. And for the question, I'm reading from, I go between a few different sources. Generally, it's going to be Eugene Holland's book on Anti-Oedipus, but I'm reading from it. Hear me say it, I'll let you know. So it's these things, this operation, it's not so much that desire's tricked, ideological thing. Oh, desire's tricked into not wanting these things. Desire's tricked into wanting X, Y, and Z. Desire is investing what it can all the time. Know what it wants. It's always trying to connect. Depression is visited on us all the time as well. And that death drive, terror, fear that is, well, if I don't do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to be out on the street. I'm not going to have money. I'm not going to have food. I'm not going to have mom, dad. This fear is visited upon us and it's taught to us. This is structure that places us as subjects. Any questions before we go on? And LJ, I actually do want to have that conversation. I'm not trying to move past without thinking about it because it is an interesting discussion. I just don't have a good answer for what you're specifically asking because it's not really off topic, but it isn't the point here, if that makes sense. I don't know. We'll get to it sometime. I'm going to annoy you at some point.
No, that's fine. I think it's still related, but
It is.
I don't want to use.
It is,
I don't
but
want
it's
to use
not
a different part of the book to refute another part of the book because they might just come from the same line that maybe I missed some part earlier, so I don't understand. So that's a very big possibility too. So I don't want to assume that there is a lot of things.
It's technically very related, and if we were having like a deep dive into like one paragraph, I would totally love to have it. This reading tends to be much more about getting through the book. So the next reading, I will just, when you join, I will be keeping up in my head.
It's fine. It's just, I think this paragraph was spanning across a lot of different things a little bit too widely. No matter how much you read, I think it's spanning too much.
It is.
Either needs to be expanded into 2 different paragraphs or maybe made into something else. It's too much.
So it's a lot there to just make because the through line, and it reads better. Again, it reads better in French. The through line is actually pretty simple because what they're doing here is they're not trying to recapitulate fully, even though that's what it seems like they're doing. What they're talking about is like Oedipus doesn't come about because we have an idea for it or this. We've shown over time, they're like, here are the limits of these different social orders because of the way that the social world is structured. Social world and production is structured a certain way. With that produces a certain type of subject. Lo and behold, look, here's Oedipus showing up when capitalism produces its subject with the family, which is what's needed. Oedipus shows up after this. They're trying to place it in order. And that's the next paragraph, I think actually this paragraph and we're about to read and the previous one is actually one paragraph in the French, I think. Let me read the next paragraph and we'll make our way. Next paragraph. In Oedipus, there is a recapitulation. Going through better. In Oedipus, there is a recapitulation of the 3 states, or the 3 machines. For Oedipus makes ready in the territorial machine as an empty, unoccupied limit. It takes form in the despotic machine as a symbolically occupied, but it is filled and carried to completion only by the imaginary Oedipus, the capitalist machine. The despotic machine preserved the primitive territorialities. Capitalist machine resuscitates the Urstadt as one of the poles of its axiomatic. It makes the despot into one of its images. That is why Oedipus gathers up everything. Everything is found again in Oedipus, which is indeed the result of universal history, but in the singular sense in which capital is already the result. Fetishes, idols, images, simulacra. Here we have the whole series. Territorial fetishes, despotic idols or symbols, then everything is recapitulated in the images of capital, which shapes and reduces them to the Oedipal simulacrum. The representative of the local group with Laius, the territoriality with Jocasta, the despot with Oedipus himself, a motley painting of everything that has ever been believed. It comes as no surprise Freud looked to Sophocles for the central image of Oedipus the despot, the myth become tragedy, in order to make the image radiate in 2 contrary directions. The ritual, primitive direction of totem and taboo, and the private direction of modern man, the dreamer. Oedipus can be a myth, tragedy, or dream. It always expresses the displacement, limit. What they're bringing it all back around to. We read this, we're finally caught up, I think, but it's why I keep going back over paragraphs. We're going to be doing that for maybe the rest of the book because this is the setup. We're at the point now. There's a line in there that is the point of these last few paragraphs, though. Seconds to.
I have a quick comment.
Please.
So
please.
In 1.4, Deleuze and Guattari reference the same thing here, a motley of painting of everything that has ever been believed.
Yep.
And I did some digging, and it's from Nietzsche's, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And it's interesting because right here they're really talking about how capitalism is almost like this very fluid thing that shifts and moves around to try and adapt to different social conditions and whatnot. And in this context, it looks like everything they're saying is reduced to Oedipus, and capitalism is so creative in how it reduces things to Oedipus. It presents itself as new always, yet it always continues to reduce itself to Oedipus. So I thought that was interesting. But one thing I was a little hesitant with when you read this was how they say that it's completed in capitalism, as if Oedipus wasn't completed in the previous socii. And I'm hesitant there. I'm hesitant there just because it seems like they're reifying a lack there, as if like the despotic socias lacked a completion.
No. That's very much their point, is that there isn't a lack. There is, if we retrospectively presume this is what the image was all along, which is very against sort of how they talk about sort of the genealogy of. We can look back and see through Oedipus, we have the prohibition of incest now. Do not do this thing. We look back and we go, oh, look, they also had the prohibition way back, like 10,000 years ago. These uncontacted tribes, they had the prohibition. Did they? Or did they just have the system that looks like they did, the after image? After we organize and we write it and map it out, we go, well, look, there's this gap, there's this space where they didn't do this thing. They must have had the prohibition, which isn't the case, not the case. So that's kind of their point, is that the parts of everything are sort of there. They open up, they say, Oedipus makes ready in the territorial as an empty, unoccupied limit. Oedipus is this supposedly prohibitive thing, but it's an empty, unoccupied limit. The edges of the germinative brain. You just can't simply have desire sort of do its thing immediately. Instead, desire is affirmatively finding other ways to sort of extract or find its connected. This is the limit that's found in the primitive tribes, if that makes sense. Kind of a hard way to talk about it. Again, Grial, I think, did great, but Godelier, the metamorphosis of kinship, super important to read. But that's the first step, is this empty, unoccupied limit. There's no one there. There's nothing that's actually prohibited, and there's nothing symbolically or actually there. An empty limit. Then there's the despotic machine, which makes the limit occupied, but not really by a person. It's a symbolic limit. And then now we have the symbolic lived limit. That's the combination that we have existing. When I say, who in your house laid down the rules? Who was the one that was more caring? Who was the lawmaker? Doesn't have to be dad, but the position exists and was held by somebody, right? It was lived.
Yeah, I think that explanation is really good. I also think that they're doing something creative here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it looks like they're saying Oedipus in the territorial machine is akin to an empty signifier. When it's in the despotic machine, it's akin to a signifier. And when it's in the capitalist machine, it's a pure signifier. And a pure signifier is a signifier without a signified, which means that it's able to kind of adapt more fluidly and kind of continue kicking the can down the road.
Well, and there's another part to this. There's another part to that you have to add in, and it's the line I've highlighted. That is why Oedipus gathers up everything. The line you're talking about is Nietzsche. Everything is found again in Oedipus, which is indeed the result of universal history, but in the singular sense in which capital is already this result. We don't get to look back on Oedipus in history without capital already being the result and the form of production through which the meaning of Oedipus is being found by us, and through which we are using as a means of production for sense and meaning inside of the systems we're in to look back on. We can't divorce ourselves from that. So we are in capital, looking back. So necessarily, Oedipus gathers up everything. Everything is found again in Oedipus, which is the result of a universal history, but in the singular sense in which capital is already this result. Fetishes, idols, images, simulacra. We have the whole series. We have all these things. And it reduces them ultimately to the Oedipal simulacrum, the copy of a copy, the position able to be held by other things that are lived, the symbol and the lived, these two elements. We are able to find the simulacrum. This is the setup. This is what they're talking about when Nietzsche says a motley painting. When they're going back in time, we have a position we're looking back through, and it can't be disregarded. It has to be considered. And that's their point ultimately. Finish out the paragraph. Did that make sense, Noah?
Yeah, no, that's completely good. And I mean, in my mind, they're also answering some of Baudrillard's criticism here as well, through how they're tying in that Nietzsche quote to the capitalist machine. So yeah, that was very good. Thank you, Brooks.
Yeah, because it's not about particularly any single image. And again, when we talk about image in capital, we went through this already. We're going to be continuing it in chapter 4, but we're talking about sort of the placeholder structure. So again, it's not, my dad was Randy Brown. Not even Randy Brown. You may know a Randy Brown. There may be, guys named Randy. Randy is the dad from South Park too, which and I always found hilarious. That these things, the name Karen, know a Karen? That's a symbolically lived position, depending on where, like, the structure of the thing is the point. That we see things, we have the structure between them, the simulacrum. Desire isn't able to directly connect with any of that. Instead, it's always dealing with this sort of odd relationship of boom, boom, boom. And that's where the image of desire is mistaken.
You mean that let me finish. You mean that consciousness as a particular individual is in fact distinct from the substance and makes an arbitrary law and fancies that it's simply knowing laws, it possesses them in their own absolute nature, right?
No.
Like,
no. Desire production. I don't. Well, I mean, there's a lot of words you use in there that I'm going to be I'm going to have a difficult time using myself, or sort of having that conversation. The idea of a consciousness that's separate from body or emotion or desire. I'm like all of these things. We're talking about desire emergently building up and creating everything that happens. It does. Desire produces, it connects. Now, as desire connects, baby born. I've gone through this a few times, but let's think through it. A child is born. There's nothing there. It is purely neurons and nerves firing off and sensations par excellence to just every extreme. Everything is firing off where it wasn't before. It was warm and safe and happy, and nothing was really connecting. You were breathing, but now it's breathing and there's noise and there's light, and you don't see shapes. That's not how any of it works. Just every nerve is going. As the day goes, and as your life goes, these sensations that are out there, nerves connect, sensations are made, sensations are recorded, things disconnect. Baby feeding, baby distracted, baby looking, baby distracted. These things slowly over time start merging. The recordings of things become something. This recording surface becomes formed as the sensations are laid into memory, the emotional holding of these things that sort of sits amongst all of these parts of our bodies. Stop sensing other parts, just like none of us really smell our own breath all day, despite someone being able to smell it like if they're a foot away. We deaden to some because it's so normal. We heighten others. This slowly morphs. And our organization that is all of these things, this is us. There is no soul. There is no consciousness. This is the production of us. And as we grow, we learn words, we learn sounds, we learn how to speak, we learn the emotional resonance between things, but we also start noticing what we aren't allowed, or we are allowed, or where emotionally we can or can't go, or where punishment happens, or where we become disconnected. We find ourselves in a capitalist society. We have rules. Make no sense, that don't have any connection to reality. It's not the same as don't touch a hot pan because you'll burn yourself. That's a rule that I can give you a very particular reason. But another one would be men aren't allowed to wear nail polish. This fucking happened to me at the store yesterday. People are fucking still weird about this stuff. But that is a rule. Why is that a rule? I think it looks cool, so I wear it. But that guy had to mention a thing. Why? These rules aren't desire connecting. It's not the same thing as reaching out for a hot pan or learning not to. It's instead the repression of that on its face. It's that entire image, or whatever it means, or the type of pleasure that gives, the type of excitement that generates, or the emotional response it gives. This I'm not allowed to have. This is a Nietzschean resentment par excellence, basically built up as I have all of this repression, and I am able to hold myself back, and I'm mad that someone else cannot. The way that a sheep is angry at the eagle for exercising his ability to kill sheep. Well, that's what the sheep doesn't have that fucking ability. Angry that the exercise, this emotional turmoil we justify and we see through the ultimate simulacra, us, the phantasm of the ego, where all of these things conjunct. The conjunction of all of them becomes I, where I am consuming all of these sensations and telling you what that sensation meant as I go, justifying my own emotion. Set up, constantly moving. This is much more of the type of subjectivity we're talking about, because this is built within a capitalist subjectivity. Inside of the family, I grow, and I'm not going to talk about my parenting style, not how I parent, or my parents. I'm going to say, like, pretty stereotypical. Dad comes home and he drinks at the end of a long day. He says nothing's worthwhile, everything's awful. But Dad, I want to play. Fuck off, kid, I'm busy. Mom's like, oh, come here, your father, he doesn't know. Give me a hug, but don't baby him. Whatever this is, this interaction becomes everything. I am investing socially through my parents in everything they do and everything they can be. Mom is the one who feeds, cooks, cleans in a traditional household. Dad's the one who's the breadwinner and the disciplinarian, also the one who does woodworking and fixing stuff around the house. Whatever it is, these two people and myself and my triangulation to them become how I organize my understanding emotionally of everything. This isn't desire. Desire's not connecting anymore. Desire's investing in images, and it's investing in safety or investing in this or that the parents now come back, and it's not them, it's everyone else in society that I'm finding these things.
But you have to be careful. I mean, desire's still connecting, right? Like it's not that desire just stops connecting. I mean, that's the trick I think you're pointing out, though. It's that it appears almost like this natural kind of flow. Like if the hand machine touches the stove machine, there's a repulsion because there's some code to the hand machine that requires a repulsion, and it's not something that is consciously or actively thought about. It just happens. And in the same way that psychoanalysts in various cases that D&G are bringing up with like Bettelheim or Klein, it's not that the kids themselves are repressed and now their machines are no longer connecting and they're fucked up. Instead, that's just what desire does. It looks like autism in the cases that D&G are looking at. It looks like, from the psychoanalyst perspective, that there's no more connections being made. This kid's donezo. There's this lack. It's over. Like, they had a shitty relationship with their refrigerator mom, and that's the way it is. But D&G are just saying that it's almost as if desire goes on to just a different path, and it's still abundant in its connectivity and its production. Yep. It's just doing it in a different way. So I would just be careful by saying like desire doesn't connect. I don't think that's
no. So it's
to say, but yeah.
The thing that's happening is desire's investing in images, but desire can't connect to images. It can't connect to those sensations, the organization of those sensations. This is early on. They talk about the way that desiring machines try to attach to the body without organs, the surface of recording, because it has those memories, those emotions, those sort of things, and there's a repulsion there. There's a negative response that happens as you try to do this. This is sort of what we might call anxiety inducing or neurotic behavior. Kind of is this sort of thing being enacted. But what we're talking about is that desire's always connecting, but it's a question of how much repression we're placing in front of it and how that repression works. Traditionally, we've thought, and psychoanalysts have talked about this idea that, you can't have this because of that. I now want it more than ever. By being told I don't want the thing, I now want it. And they go, oh, there's a twist there, because the thing isn't the thing. Someone may be sexually aroused by a person, and they may want, like, again, they don't know sex. Sex isn't the thing desire wants, but they may want connection. That prohibited. No, you can't, because that person is your mother, your sister. But now, what were they attracted to? What is the thing that they wanted? What's the setup? How is these attractions coming? the images are shifted. The attraction, the desire is shifted. It's now put into a thing very similar to our repressive or our relationships, where it's my relationship with my boss as my dad, whatever it may be. These things become images, and they're invested directly, and it doesn't work the same way as simple desiring connections. It creates its own repression, which is their point. The investment in images creates the repressive response. And that's kind of the whole point of this thing, that repression, anti-production, is actually is an affirming part of the process. It's not a lack. It's not something missing. It is an affirming process that is produced alongside this investment in images.
You mean that repression is the return of the repressed? Or yeah.
Just to okay, on YouTube you're cutting in and out like it.
I'm sorry. I just turned off the noise gate entirely. A stupid fucking OBS. I hate this shit.
Yeah. So you've seen the comments.
Yeah, I saw. I'm trying to fix it as we're going, and it's like, God damn it.
All right.
So I'll just leave it open, and you just get all my background noise.
I don't hear it, but it's on YouTube.
Oh, you will. I breathe heavy.
I don't have the audio cutting on and off.
Oh, you won't. Discord is awesome. OBS is a weird, shitty nightmare. It's for as much money and time as the world of streaming has had, there's no good tools for streaming. It's kind of amazing. Like, when you consider how much profit is being extracted by the companies, the number one tool everyone uses is open source. It's fucking weird. Very frustrating.
I mean, just from my end, all the audios has been normal, and I don't hear any noise in the background either.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, Discord's much better about it. They're different audio in and outs. It's a nightmare. But the underlying thing is, again, none of these things are, to just make sure I know I know I'm reading. None of these things are innately negative. This is not saying, oh, investing in images is bad or will result in bad. No. The question at the base of a lot of this is like, again, how do men support their own repression? Why do men vote for and desire their own repression? Well, and it's not so much that men desire their repression directly, which would be silly. Of course, they don't go, yes, I want to be repressed. Instead, the way that capital produces people and subjectivity creates people that are invested in images. And through those images, the nature of anti-production and repression is visited upon desire in this process. This thing happens. Doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's bad. This is the process for these things. This is the phrasing they have sort of at the end of this, the last three paragraphs. And this is to just continue reading, because I actually want to make sure we've got I want to try to get through this. We're going to get through all of this today. I'm going to finish this fucking section today. I'm going to read the next paragraph. It's long. I'm going to take pauses, but this is kind of, they're finishing out the point through the rest of this section. It's like 4 paragraphs left. Oedipus would be nothing if the symbolic position of an object from on high in the despotic machine did not first make possible the folding and flattening operations that will constitute Oedipus in the modern social field, the triangulation's cause. Whence the extreme importance, but also the indeterminate nature, the non-decidability of the argument advanced by psychoanalysis's most profound innovator, which makes the displaced limit pass between the symbolic and the imaginary, between symbolic castration and imaginary Oedipus. For castration in the order of the despotic signifier, as the law of the despot or the effect of the object from on high, is in reality the formal condition of the Oedipal images that will be deployed in the field of eminence left uncovered by the withdrawal of the signifier. I reach desire when I arrive at castration. What does the desire-castration equation signify, if not, in fact, a prodigious operation that consists in replacing desire under the law of the despot, in introducing lack there at the deepest levels, and in rescuing us from Oedipus by means of a fantastic regression. A fantastic and brilliant regression, Someone had to do it. No one helped me, as Lacan says, to shake loose the yoke of Oedipus and carry it to the point of its autocritique. But it is like the story of the resistance fighters who wanted to destroy a pylon, balanced the plastic charges so well that the pylon blew up and fell back into its hole. From the symbolic to the imaginary, from castration to Oedipus, from the despotic age to capitalism. Inversely, there is the progress leading to the withdrawal of the overseeing and overcoding object from on high, which gives way to a social field of immanence, where the decoded flux produce images and level them down. Just taking a pause here. If you haven't read Lacan, start. It's good stuff generally, and they're not joking when they say that like he was like kind of the most, what do they say, the most profound innovator in psychoanalysis. Not a joke. They pretty good shit. This is a critique of Lacan, who kind of tried to take Freud's stuff, make some significant moves with it, and their critique is sort of there. Again, I'm not here to teach Lacan, nor should I. I don't believe I have the capability. But that's for anyone who's like, what? They're just making critiques that are particular to Lacan at this point. That's kind of the mark. The rest of this we can actually break out without having to revisit and talk about Lacan at large. So before I move on, is everyone good with that? Yeah, no, we have on Fridays, we have a reading of the Purloined Letter, which should be also followed by the Purloined Poe, which is one of my favorite books on Lacan. But the Purloined Letter, Lacan's lecture, is phenomenal. And very much, I think, gets to, when we talk of the signified and signifier, the imaginary symbolic, how these things interplay inside of how we produce meaning and how meaning is made. It's a really, really good piece. Also, if you like Poe, it's a fucking good breakdown of Poe. So it wins on like all the levels. I don't think anyone will disagree with that. I hope not. To continue. Whence the two aspects of the signifier, a barred transcendent signifier, taken in a maximum that introduces lack, and an immanent system of relations between minimal elements that come to fill the uncovered field, somewhat similar in traditional terms to the way one goes from the Parmenidean being to the atoms of Democritus. A transcendent object that is more and more spiritualized, for a field of forces that is more and more immanent, more and more internalized. This describes the evolution of the infinite debt through Catholicism, then the Reformation. The extreme spiritualization of the despotic state, the extreme internalization of the capitalist field, define bad conscience. This is used in terms similar to Nietzsche. The latter is not cynicism's contrary. It is, in private persons, the correlate of the cynicism of social persons. All the cynical tactics of bad conscience, just as Nietzsche and then Lawrence and Miller analyzed them to arrive at a definition of civilized European man. The hypnosis and the reign of images, the torpor they spread, the hatred of life and all that is free, of all that passes and flows, the universal effusion of the death instinct, depression and guilt used as a means of contagion, the kiss of the vampire. Aren't you ashamed to be happy? Follow my example. I won't let you go before you say, it's my fault. Oh, ignoble contagion of the depressives, neurosis as the only illness consisting in making others ill. The permissive structure, let me deceive, rob, slaughter, and kill, but in the name of the social order, and so dammy mommy will be proud of me. The double direction given to resentment, the turning back against oneself and the projection against the other. The father is dead. It's my fault. Who killed him? It's your fault. It's the Jews, the Arabs, the Chinese, all the resources of racism and segregation. The abject desire to be loved, the whimpering at not being loved enough and not being understood, concurrent with the reduction of sexuality to the dirty little secret, this whole priest's psychology. There is not a single one of these tactics that does not find in Oedipus its land of milk and honey, its good provider. Nor is there a single one of these tactics that does not serve and develop in psychoanalysis, with the latter as the new avatar of the ascetic ideal. Large paragraph, critique across the board of Lacan, big time here, to just shorten it because they're going to kind of mention this in a second. The big critique they have of Lacan is that he did some amazing work. Their critique, a lot of people are like, Deleuze hated Lacan or Guattari hated Lacan. It's like, oh, fuck, no, stop that. These people didn't hate fucking anybody. Their critique of Lacan is that all the good work he did, and he did a lot of good work, breaking down how the symbolic order operated, how there was a master signifier that sort of reigned meaning through the rest is almost a thread. This is where Guattari broke off and went, but wait, what you're talking about is the anachronistic elements, the leftovers of the old machine, the despotic machine. You're talking, Lacan, about the way that language written and spoken works, but language written and spoken was invented under the despotic. What you're talking about is how the despotic operates. Capital breaks things down. So what they're trying to do is take Lacan, build on top of it, and say, here is actually how things work in the modern space. And yeah, Estelle, the story goes from Deleuze himself that he visited Lacan once. Lacan kept him waiting, which I mean, he's a cool French guy. I'm sure he was like doing some stuff, but he brings him in and he basically gave him a huge hug, told him how much he loved the book. And he said, I wish I had more students like you, because he liked to be challenged. He liked to be fucked with like that. And that's kind of the thrust here. They wanted to go Lacan's understanding, and with that, like there's a bunch of others that he was building off of. That's under the despotic, the king, the despotic signifier, the master signifier, that system of language is there. We're breaking away from that. Capital's done away from that. Yomslev has taken semiotics in a brand new direction. We need to take a look at how capitalism breaks meaning down. And that
not situating the subject in a symbolic order, right?
Correct. Changing the relationship with the subject to the symbolic, again, because there is no despot who's saying what meaning is. The master signifier doesn't really have a place today, but it's an archaism, a thing left over from previous times that still is sitting with us, but that we see every day new ways that it's being broken and shifted and changed. Yeah, someone on YouTube put it best. May all our worldviews become both worthy and dated, like Lacan's. That's a very good way to put it. Deeply important shit, Lacan. Worth reading. Don't read everything. Don't. Unless it's super your thing, which is great. But don't like go out and buy a Kritz and go read it. That's not the way to do it. Read a seminar, join our reading. Read Zizek. Zizek's books on Lacan are fucking excellent, to be frank. They help a lot. It's worth reading. Not as much as Deleuze and Guattari, though. But yeah. So that's where we're at. The critique goes all the way through. This odd thing where we have this, again, images, the symbolic, the things being able to be applied. Suddenly we have this odd social order, this revitalized Erstadt despotic master signifier system where we have the ability to apply symbols everywhere. That's that great lines they have at the end here. This is kind of this more poetic thing in the style of a little bit of Lawrence and Miller as they do their critique of European man. But the point overall, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that, here they're being very careful with their language. I mean, Lacan in some ways gets pretty close. I mean, the subject is not just in the symbolic for Lacan, it's a split subject, right? So they're kind of looking at it from almost an inverse. They're not saying, hey, language isn't what defines the subject and the lack of it, but rather maybe the symbolic was kind of positioning the subject at all within the symbolic was maybe just the problem, right? And I think Lacan's very close to getting there, but there's something kind of holding him back, and that's what they kind of say here on 268, that he's trying so hard and he gets close, especially, with the seminar on the Purloined Letter, where he expands on the symbolic and talks about the symbolic chain and introduces the pure signifier and whatnot. So Lacan gets very close. So I agree with you. Some people, I mean, will just say like, oh, like fuck Lacan, like don't read Lacan, and like what you're saying, it's like maybe you don't need to read all of Lacan, but I think like the seminar will do, because that's very important here, because they're really building from Lacan, and if anything, they're showing how Lacan's view is truly just what the paralogisms are, right? So they're kind of just saying,
the paralogisms up through Capital, where the last little bits are introduced, because again, their critique of representation is it's layering on. As someone on the YouTube chat says, what they're trying to do, and it's also important to think of the history and the time of all of this. Marxism, as we talk about it, a hyper-materialist, whatever you want to call it, I don't want to say it fell out of favor in French circles. It didn't. It morphed into very similar to kind of what we see now, if like we have Marxist-Leninists on YouTube talking about how they're leftists, or how people who are pro-Russia, who are the true communists. Like there was some weird interplay that kind of, I don't want to say moved people away from Marxism, might be a decent way to put it. I think of the book Oriental Despotism that they take a lot from. And that guy basically, he was almost drummed out of academic circles because he critiqued Russia at the time, the USSR, and talked about how they weren't Marxist. He was almost completely kicked out of academic circles. So here's Lacan, and he's trying to take Freud, who was very much playing with what he considered to be a material conception of things. He took notes from Darwin and like a scientific positivism, but Lacan didn't really notice that he was playing with things that were ultimately transcendent. And that is where I think the critique for Guattari takes its turn, where it's like, no, actually, here's how these things are material, here's how they return, and here's how we've moved beyond that, and here's why. And I think it's very, very, there's a handful of very, very succinct essays on Lacan in Chaosophy and Psychoanalysis and Transversality. I can never remember I don't know why. Both have a lot of very good essays on Lacanian concepts as he's sort of early building his critiques, and also later. Totally worth reading. But go for it.
To bring it back to this reading too, I think Marx is really ahead of his time for D&G, because when you look at something like commodity fetishism, which they bring up very early in the book, like 1.1, and they're carrying it throughout, they're showing that, you know, Marx, it's not just the fact that I can look at a Gucci belt and say, like, holy shit, that's so cool. Like, there's something so great about it just because of the brand or the price. It's everything else. It's people looking at the Bible and thinking that there's some magical property emanating from it. People look at the familial structure or the house or the types of jobs that they have, etc., so on and so forth. And they're sort of showing how Oedipus is able to be framed or is kind of, I don't want to say produced by Capital, but I mean, I think that they're trying to show that everything can be reduced to Oedipus in the same kind of context of commodity fetishism. But to do that, they need to have some Lacan, I think.
Well, and that's when they start talking about in this next paragraph, I think they're going to make a significant point towards that, especially as we start talking about the Ndimbu and the work Grial did, which is very much in this next paragraph. The important thing, as they're saying, is not that thinking of psychoanalysis as inventing Oedipus. The name is almost irrelevant. Instead, it's giving a territoriality to it. It's giving a space to it that, I mean, they're going to make the critique. I'm kind of just going to keep moving. The next paragraph, I think, goes into this. So let's keep diving. Any last notes, anything? On YouTube, someone asks, is there a notion of imaginary exchange like there is of symbolic? This is completely wiped out in D&G's handling of everything. It's a debt-based, exchangism is gone, blah, blah, blah. We can go into it. Hit me up. I'm going to start doing a lot more evening streams, like an hour or two. So join me for one of those and we can go into it a little bit deeper, because it's actually a really fun question. But again, like LJ's, it's on topic, but it's just off topic enough to be able to make it through. And I really want to finish. I want to finish this fucking section today because I want to move into schizoanalysis, which is, to me, the most interesting. It's where praxis can be found and how we can recognize and what work can be done and how we can talk about it. It's building that. I find it very useful. So we'll get to it. Yeah, go for it. LJ, I heard you, LJ. I'm certain it was you.
Yeah, we can have a few sentences after the whole thing.
Yes,
today's
no, let's do that. Yeah, let's do that. Make sure we do. I'm not going to have a ton of time after, but I want to make sure we do revisit it a little bit. Sounds great. Good. Once again, psychoanalysis does not invent Oedipus. It merely provides the latter a last territoriality, the couch, and a last law, the analyst as despot and money collector, but the mother as the simulacrum of territoriality, the father as the simulacrum of the despotic law, with the slashed, split, castrated ego, are the products of capitalism insofar as it engineers an operation that has no equivalent in the other social formations. Everywhere else, the familial position is merely a stimulus to the investment of the social field by desire. The familial images function only by opening onto social images to which they become coupled or which they confront in the course of struggles and compromises, so that what is invested through the breaks and segments of families is the economic, political, and cultural breaks of the field into which they are plunged. For example, the Ndimbu schizophrenic. This is the case even in the peripheral zones of capitalism, where the colonizers' efforts at Oedipalizing the indigenous population, African Oedipus, find themselves contradicted by the breakup of the family along the lines of social exploitation and oppression. But it is at the soft center of capitalism, in the temperate zones of the bourgeoisie, that the colony becomes intimate and private, interior to each person. It is there that the flux of the investment of desire, which travels from the familial stimulus to the social organization or disorganization, is, as it were, covered over by a reflux that flattens the social investment onto the familial investment, serving as a pseudo-organizer. The family has become the locus of retention and resonance of all the social determinations. It falls to the reactionary investment of the capitalist field to apply all the social images to the simulacra of the extended family. And with the result that wherever one turns, one no longer finds anything but father, mother. The Oedipal filth that sticks to our skin. Yes, yes, yes. I desired my mother and wanted to kill my father. A single subject of enunciation, Oedipus, for all the capitalist statements, and between the two, the leveling cleavage of castration. There's one note, and then we'll start breaking up. That line, covered over by a reflux. First time I read that 3 years ago, started me down the path of needing to learn French. 4 years ago? 3 years ago. It's got to be 3 years. 3 years and a month or so. Led me down the path of having to learn French and noticing that flux is written differently. The note here is the thing. It's being covered by a reflux, afflux, reflux. They're expulsions of different types. The language will matter when we get to it. Oedipus as a thing, as an idea or whatever it may be, it's not so much that like psychoanalysis invented it. The organization of the productive order of capitalism created the structure that we call Oedipus. That's the setup. We have basically a mother who is our security, the land, our territoriality, the space with which we're able to move, the caring for us. Again, this is how they're seen. Everyone's got their own thing. I'm not going to fight with people over whether or not mom or dad. But the father is the simulacrum of despotic law. This setup, the territoriality of the despotic law, and this split castrated ego, all of these three, these are the products of capitalism, as insofar as it engineers an operation that has no equivalent in other social formations. Everywhere else, the familial position is merely a stimulus to the investment of the social field by desire. The familial position, your parents or whoever they were are like distributed. We have a mom and dad. Dad goes, comes back. I have a mom. I have a dad. Most homes in America and in the West are this. I think actually most of the world. This is the thing. They have a mom, a dad, a grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, these designations that are embodied by people. In primitive cultures, and also we saw this also in under the despotic for the most part, but in primitive cultures, you were more of a distributed person. You would do mothering duties sort of, and then you'd also sort of do uncling, and then you'd do hunting, and then you do dadding, and someone else could do dadding while you were uncling. Like a person, people went around and did a whole bunch of stuff. They weren't embodied in a position. That's not how it was set up socially. So because of that, the familial position was more a stimulus to the investment of the social field by desire. The familial images function only by opening onto social images to which they become coupled or which they confront. Think of it as friends or not, people they worked with, people they didn't get along with in various ways, but that coupling was more the center of it rather than my dad went to work, his boss. No, it's this people connecting and doing shit or fighting and not doing shit together, that kind of thing. This setup is very different. And we started to see this when Capital, and it has expanded. Early work, the Ndembu Schizophrenia, I have Griol's book here. He did a series of book on the Ndembu. I actually think I have, I have that specific one actually. Really interesting study on the idea of what it meant to be a deep, what we would call now a extremely autistic person in this space, or someone who found themselves broken in that way. And I say broken normatively, not actually. When the Ndembu and people in Africa have it, these odd moments, they don't really have the same familial connections because, I mean, you're free to read other books on this, but basically we decimated their familial connections by destroying them and breaking them apart at every corner in every way, everywhere. And it's not just us. There's a conquering people across the board where we colonized. Very often you'd extract the working man and you'd use the children. Barbados, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti, sugarcane fields, chattel slavery in the U.S., obviously, or whatever the fuck the Dutch were up to in Africa, plus a bunch of other countries. You would actually have a much more striated family structure that was broken apart, didn't handle family the same way that we forced on them. So it didn't land. This was the African Oedipus. It was contradicted by the breakup of the family along the lines of social exploitation and oppression. That's a reason that it is how it is in a lot of these places. But at the soft center of capitalism, the temperate zone of the bourgeoisie, the colony becomes intimate and private. And this is happening more everywhere else as well. You can see this even in formerly colonized places. India comes to mind, and the extreme Hinduist movements that are happening there that are very much focused on man-woman, Oedipalization, capital production, and things like that, despite being incredibly oppressed and brutalized by the English, amongst others, but for sure the UK for a very long time. This setup is what they're talking about. It is there that the flux of the investment of desire, which travels from familial stimulus to social organization, is, as it were, covered over by a reflux. Important wording here. This flux of connection covered over by a reflux that flattens the social investment onto the familial investment, serving as a pseudo-organizer. Capital pseudo-organizer. This is the setup. The family is now the locus of retention and resonance of all social determination. It falls to the reactionary investment of the capitalist field to apply all the social images to the simulacra of the restricted family, with the result that wherever one turns, no one finds anything but father, mother. This is the structure of capital. Psychoanalysis didn't give us Oedipus. It named Oedipus, but it didn't invent Oedipus. Instead, this is the structure necessary to capitalism as it functions and produces us. This part feels dated. What part? I think it's not very dated. I mean, it's horrifying, but it's not psychotically dated. Come on, Noah.
So, like it or not, like the edible myth is actually an edible myth. Like it or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the whole point, as they said before, I think a couple of paragraphs ago, that Freud chose Oedipus particularly because it's a callback to the old to name the new, and it's a bridging of those two. That's what myth kind of does. They have a handful of critiques elsewhere that sort of talk about that. So that's the setup, that Oedipus was introduced to give us cover. That, oh, look, it's as far back as forever. It's able to go back, but we don't realize we're looking back at ourselves and our history through ourselves. We've had this fantastic discussion. We're going to be doing a lot more work on inner experience, not just because of someone accidentally mentioning Bataille's book, but starting to talk about, do you have an inner monologue? What does existence mean and inner experience mean to you? And everyone is different enough. There's actually if you keep asking questions, you will find a way that you're different than someone else. This thing we do, though, we presume the inner experience is the same for everyone. This presumption is sort of baked into how we deal with the world, but also how we deal with history. We see things as they are and presume mostly they were that way. When we say that we have an exchange-based economy, which ostensibly we do, I've got critiques there, but let's just say you buy that. Then you go, oh, look, it's always been that way because you're able to find it. Oh, look, I could right now go show you examples of how everyone's always had a mom and a dad. How silly of Brooks to say otherwise. Why would these D&G assholes say anything else? Well, it's because we're looking at them through this symbolic lens that's allowing anything to fit that. The images can be applied wherever. They're simulacra by definition. And so when I have mom and dad and I'm able to find them everywhere, I can find them everywhere. And that through line through history is the thing that they're like, look, they didn't invent Oedipus. That's not what happened here. They named it, but they named it in line with the people produced already by this complex in this form of production that is capital in this historical progression all the way across. Everything leading to, it's not deterministic. Don't fucking do that to me. But that setup, the age of iPad kids is different than the Freudian family. No, it is not. It's not that. It's different in details, but there's a whole bunch of shit going on there. We can talk about that, but I'll get to it in a second. I want to make sure I'm answering everything from Marcellus Wallace. Do you know how difficult it is for me not to say a sentence whenever I say your name? There's one sentence and I'm not going to say it, but I love that movie. So
call me Isam. Call me Isam. It's easy. Isam.
There you go. That'll work.
Right?
Sounds good.
So one of the most striking story is about like Lacan, and I'm sorry, but like one of the most striking elements of the story about the subject development is that there's a story about a kind of someone who's kind of got, he's have been treated by Lacan, like, but it's his aversion to the Quranic law, right? And this law is something infinitely more capable than we can imagine. So that's what Lacan prescribing here, right? One of his cases, right? And in the culture sphere in the Middle East, right? They define it as rendered into Caesar, the things which be Caesars, and into God, the things which is God. In the Islamic sphere, right? And that's on the contrary, right? If that makes sense, right? This like Christian law, right? It's a contrary. That the law has a totalization, a character which on no account permit an isolation of judicial form from the religious sphere, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Lacan talking about one of his cases, right? And how he explained to him. So the subject manifests a failure to recognize or misrecognition of the Quranic law. That's the basic of the story. and in the subject who belongs to his ancestry, his functions, his future to this cultural sphere. This to be more specific, this was something which strike Lacan, right? In passing, in the line of the idea, which he believed to be sound enough that he's not failed to recognize the symbolic apprentices of the subject. So Lacan said that this put us on a hot and on the trail of what was at issue. In fact, the Quranic law decrees the following with respect to the person who is found guilty of theft: the hand will be cut off. Now, the subject had in his childhood been caught up in whirlwind, both private and public, which which amount to the following: that he had heard the patient to whom Lacan treat, that he had heard and said, and it was quite a scene. And his father, being the patient, the analysant, his father being a civil servant and having lost his position, that his father was that's his father is a thief and must therefore have his hand cut off, right? So his father, he talking about a patient where kind of in an Islamic culture where his father being a civil servant and have lost his position, and he heard about like that his father was a thief and must therefore be, you know, he heard about like in something in a conversation that his father has lost his job being a civil servant, and his father was a thief and must therefore has his hand to be cut off. To be sure, as Lacan said, for a long time now the prescription has not put into effect, and no more than that belongs to the laws of the menu. Whoever has committed an incest with his mother must tear off his genital and carrying them in his hand will go towards the west, but it doesn't remain any less inscripted in the symbolic order which founds interhuman relations and which is called the law. The proposition was for the subject, thus isolated off from the rest of the law in privileged manner, and it become lodged in the symptoms. All the other symbolic references of my patient, all these primitive arena around such a subject finds his most fundamental relation to the universal of the symbolic or organized, were forfeit on the account of particular emphasis that this prescription has acquired for him. For him, it lies in the center of an entire series of indemnifiable, uh, uh, con, confusional, symptomatic, unconscious expression linked to the primal childhood experience, right? So what we deduce from that, we deduce the relation, right? The symbolic relation, right? And how, like, language, right? So for Lacan, desire.
Yes. It sort the social order of things, the socius that exists, the earth socius, is, again, it's important for us to remove how the social order we consider it versus how it is now in the primitive societies and uncontacted tribes, prehistorical tribes, whatever it may be. The social world is something we're in. Every family is just in the social world. Every person is. There's no such thing as a family except as like a loose collection of people. It's not segregated. It's not separated off. There isn't the social world and the family. The family is part of it. They're directly dealing with it. Even under the despotic The social world is very much just directly there. You have this interesting thing with the king or the godhead or whatever he is who kind of controls stuff and kind of becomes that. Within capital, though, the social world is, because meaning is directly built by capital, fucking your family ain't involved. The subject that is built inside of the earth or the despotic socius, the previous territorialities, the previous ways things were set up, that the social made the subject. That's not fucking happening in capital. The social doesn't make the subject. The family makes the subject, because capital doesn't give a shit. It is economic. It's not only non-individual, but it's abstract, and it's working in kind of its own particular way with bits and pieces, certainly not dealing with whole bodies. At best, we're aggregate sort of things, but any individual is irrelevant effectively to capital at large. So what happens? Well, this is the reason that we have our subjectivity form as we do. The family, because of how sort of things are sort of broken up and how things are, because they're attached to the way that money works. A baby can't make money. There you go. That's it. For a long time, women couldn't make money. And even if they could, that they really needed to just spit out a bunch more kids, because kids can help support, family farm or this or that. But with capital, the family became the focus, segregated from this social, larger meaning generation that's happening. Capital doesn't give a shit about any of that. So the family deals with it. But the family doesn't have an economy the same way that the social world does now. The family's not connected to the larger sets of social meanings. Instead, I now have, as a child or as a wife or as a husband, I have not only particular roles to fill, but I have a symbolic placement that I have to fulfill. That symbolic thing that I'm doing, the relationships we have no longer are mediated by survival. The rules of the house aren't mediated by there's a tiger outside or that we need to go catch our food. These things are not really how families are organized or how survival works now. We also don't really often, maybe, God, get it while it's hot. We've got a couple of years left. We don't have kings who can just kill anyone on whims. It's not really where we exist for the most part. Most of us are pretty lucky, I guess. But that thing that's happening, the family is the one that decides how you learn, what you do, how you do things, what you grow as. And so the family becomes this order. It's organically built this way. It isn't that capital went, I need to create a family. It's that because of the way labor is distributed and extracted, necessarily kids are ancillary until they're a certain age. And so as such, they're the responsibility of the person who has them, and they're no longer socially formed, which would be the case under the earth or even despotic socius. This change puts the family in a very fucked up position where they have to make the kids good workers. They have to make sure that they can survive. If you have a dog, you do this. If you have a dog, you make sure the dog isn't just going to attack whatever. You train it. You make sure it doesn't run out in the middle of traffic or X, Y, and Z. You certainly do this with a child. You want to make sure the kid can survive on their own. If you die, you don't want your kid to be fucking on the street the next day. You've got to make sure that they're taken care of. All of these fears and setups, this is your job. And so as such, this child learns everything from mom and dad, or mom, dad, again, doesn't matter. But they learn everything from parents before they enter the social field. But what they learn is everything. So because they learn everything through their parents, they then find associations. That's why we have school marm as a term in America, the teachers or woman who ran the local school. That's why we have the, rules around, generally we think of mayors as men for the longest time. These setups were because we had this weird need to treat and create within the nuclear family the subjectivity that would survive outside of it. Again, these are emergent from the material conditions that are existent at the time. And so now what we've got, and again, things have changed, they're shifting in all kinds of things, but this is the material conditions and the form of stuff that now new people are being built every single day. I've got kids, and there is a wrestle between how much freedom do you want to give and how much repression, how much, because you're making sure they can survive. Because capitalism works in a way where if they don't, they're dead. I'm in America. I don't want my kids on the street at fucking 12 because mom and dad got hit by a car. There's a bunch of stuff like that. So these things that are happening, they set up in a very particular position, and they created through the historical reality, a type of desiring production that finds investment in the images that mom and dad produce, and then through life, they find ways to match everything to that and emotionally find resonance where it needs to. And this is the final point they say, all the capitalist statements between the two, the leveling cleavage of castration. And I want to get through the next paragraph because it's Marx, and I've just used the words material conditions. This is to just lead right in. Marx said that Luther's merit was to have determined the essence of religion, no longer on the side of the object, but as an interior religiosity. That the merit of Adam Smith and Ricardo was to have determined the essence or nature of wealth, no longer as an objective nature, but as an abstract and deterritorialized subjective essence, the activity of production in general. But as this determination develops under the conditions of capitalism, they objectify the essence all over again. They alienate and re-territorialize it, this time in the form of the private ownership of the means of production, so that capitalism is without doubt the universal of every society, but only insofar as it is capable of carrying to a certain point its own critique, that is, the critique of the processes by which it re-enslaves what within it tends to free itself or to appear freely, desire. The same thing must be said of Freud. His greatness lies in having determined the essence or nature of desire, no longer in relation to objects, aims, or even sources, but as an abstract subjective essence, libido, sexuality. But he still relates this essence to the family as the last territoriality of the private man, whence the position of Oedipus, marginal at first in 3 essays, then centering more and more around desire. It is as though Freud were asking to be forgiven his profound discovery of sexuality by saying to us, well, don't worry, it's not going to go at least further than the family. The dirty little secret, in place of the wide open spaces glimpsed for a moment. The familialist reduction in place of the drift of desire, in place of the great decoded flux, little streams recorded in mommy's bed, interiority in place of a new relationship with the outside. Throughout psychoanalysis, the discourse of bad conscience and guilt always rises up and finds its nourishment, what is called being cured. I love that piece. I'm going to finish this and then we're going to discuss. On 2 points at least, Freud exonerates the real exterior family of any wrongs, the better to internalize the family and the wrongs in the person of the family's smallest member, the child. The way in which he posits an autonomous repression independent of social repression, the way in which he abandons the theme of the seduction of the child by the adult in order to substitute the individual fantasy that makes the real parents into so many innocents or even victims. For the family must appear in 2 forms, one where doubtless it is guilty, but only in the manner in which the child lives it intensely, internally, and where it is confounded with the child's own guilt. The other, where it is a tribunal of responsibility, before which one stands as a guilty child, and in relation to which one becomes a responsible adult. Oedipus's sickness and sanity, the family as alienating factor and agent of de-alienation, if only through the way in which it is reconstituted in the transference. This is what Foucault has shown in his very fine analysis. The familialism inherent in psychoanalysis doesn't so much destroy classical psychiatry as shine forth as the latter's crowning achievement. After the madman of the earth and the madman of the despot comes the madman of the family. What 19th century psychiatry had wanted to reorganize in the asylum, the imperative fiction of the family, reason the father, madness the child or minor, and parents who are ill only from their own childhood. All this finds its fulfillment outside the asylum in psychoanalysis and in the consulting room of the analyst. Freud is the Luther and the Adam Smith of psychiatry. He mobilizes all the resources of myth, of tragedy, of dreams in order to re-enslave desire, this time from within, an intimate theater. Yes, Oedipus is nevertheless the universal of desire, the product of universal history, but on one condition, which is not met by Freud. that Oedipus be capable, at least to a certain point, of conducting its auto-critique. Universal history is nothing more than a theology, if it does not seize control of the conditions of its contingent singular existence, its irony, its own critique. What are these conditions, this point where the auto-critique is possible and necessary? To discover beneath the familial reduction the nature of the social investments of the unconscious. To discover beneath the individual fantasy the nature of group fantasies, or what amounts to the same thing, to push the simulacrum to the point where it ceases to be the image of an image, so as to discover the abstract figures, the schiz's flux that it harbors and conceals, to substitute for the private subject of castration, split into a subject of enunciation and a subject of the statement relating only to the two orders of personal images, the collective agents of enunciation that for their part refer to machinic arrangements, to overturn the theater of representation into the order of desiring production. This is the whole task of schizoanalysis. I love that very much.
Oscar, where's deleuze?
Yes.
Oscar winning.
It's a lovely piece. It ends very nicely. And again, it ends with, we're going to be talking about how to, like, the things that can be done. And we will. Thank God. Finally, chapter. This is where we're going to be next week. Chapter 4. Hey, look at that. Chapter 4. How happy. But before we get there, the critiques and the ideas that have come out of AO that a lot of people talk about and a lot of people discuss, and it's really worth just taking a moment on. It is not about the obliteration of psychiatry. It's not about the obliteration of subjectivity. It's not about the obliteration of social order, that everyone should run around being schizophrenic or whatever the fuck that means. This is about understanding desire and its interactions with the material conditions with which we exist in, and how these things interact to produce us. And through this production of us and everything, we find ways to repress ourselves and enjoy it. This last two paragraphs is that. This is the drive at the base of it. Universal history is nothing more than a theology if it does not seize control of the conditions of its contingent singular existence, its irony and its own critique. It's probably one of my favorite lines from this. The universal history is seen through the position we're in discussing, because we have an understanding of the BWO, because we have capital, because of these things, this subjectivity we have. Let's go back. Universal history is able, but if it does not seize control of the conditions of its contingent singular existence, its irony and its own critique, it's just religion, which is,
it's become a critical criticism, as
yes.
in the Holy Family.
Well, it's 100%.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic book. I've been reading. You can see it right here behind my head if you're on YouTube. It's a pink goddamn book. It's called The Idea of Pure Critique, where this guy takes Deleuze and through Kant and goes, there's a difference between criticism and critique. And here is how criticism and critique work, and all of this through what is philosophy, through AO and logic of sense. It's a phenomenal read. But this is what we're talking about, is getting to the critique that around the thing or over the thing. There's a lot of topologies, a really fun way to use this. But what we're not talking about is just saying capital bad, emotionally responding. Oh yeah, no, things suck. It's like, no. Here's the structure of things right now. Here's where these pieces came from. Here is how they may be misinterpreted and misunderstood. Here is how desire interacts and how the paralogisms come. This is a logic of libido, is kind of what you could call Anti-Oedipus. I've called it the blueprint of libido, the logic of libido. I've kind of come to as my over clever way of describing it, but that's kind of the idea. This is about the logic of libidinal investments and how they operate, and how ultimately through material conditions they produce us, and through this we then reinvest in that ever circulating process that does not stop. It's not like we kind of hit a point and go, hey guys, we're good. Nope. Constant, always produces us. And that's a really fantastic way to end it. With that, we are over time, but I don't care. So we're going to go. If anyone have questions, comments, anything here, now would be the time before I bounce the fuck out. because I'm frying actually at this point. And
I have a question.
I want to get to LJ's conversation with me before I do. Yes, Noah.
Yeah, quick question. So I know that capitalism produces the schizophrenic as the subject of deterritorialized flows, which is necessary for
Flux.
decoding flows. Flux, sorry, I know that you are a stickler, but in terms of the recoding of flows, would it be okay to say
there's no recoding?
No, there definitely is recoding.
Nope.
It's all throughout 1.4. So, because like if we don't have recoding, then that means that the schizophrenic is able to completely dismantle dissocius. Maybe I think they say reterritorialize more, so maybe I could just say that instead. But if the schizophrenic is, produced at the limit or is necessary for deterritorializing those.
One sec, I just have to pull out. I hate this fucking translation so much. Okay, let's find out where the fuck is this said. I want to find out what it is in the original. Give me a moment. Civilized capitalist machine. Excellent. I can get there. Oh no, wait. That's actually discussing the. No. Okay, so I'm seeing in the English, it's page 34 is okay, under the despotic, the Urstadt, there is recoding. So I'm not saying there never was. I'm talking particularly right now. Okay. Does that make sense? So when I'm talking particularly, I'm saying, I'm assuming you're talking about capital. Very few times is recode used for that. The state, the Urstadt, and the despot recodes, overcodes. They use that a little interchangeably. Does that make, is what I'm saying following with how you read your thing? Yes or no?
Well, I think that they, begin by kind of talking about how capitalism needs to, decode flows, and that they produce a schizophrenic at, the end of the line or at the limit. They do say recode, and they say that capitalism or contradictions of capitalism is built into the system because of decoding and recoding happening simultaneously. So I wanted to ask, would it be proper to say that capitalism produces Oedipus as a reterritorialization of the flows?
I'm it's going to take a second as I'm slowly making my way through and finding exactly where in the French, because I don't have my French PDF isn't OCR'd. It's a whole thing, so I actually have to look and find it.
Because if it's only decoding, then that means it's never going to come back to capital, right? Like that would be a completely deterritorialized
Actually, I agree with what you said, but I feel like that's not the whole picture about and it has to do with the question I want to ask Brooks. Because sometimes you need the uncoded thing to accumulate to a certain level, and then whatever Oedipus thing kicks in, so the recoding actually makes sense. Otherwise, the recoding is so fragmented, nobody knows what it means for this recoding to happen. It's completely unobservable, and it doesn't really form anything.
The challenge is, if we're talking about code operates in a very particular way. And it's not a way that is compatible with capital for a few reasons. Wow. We can go into that. Has to do with the difference between code and axiomatic and how it operates. I can pull out, they say it better than me, but one moment. I'm just trying to find. Sorry, this is just going to take a second. Apologies, anyone who's being forced to watch me as I do this. Capitalism just restores instrument. Yeah. They do you that. Where is the section you're saying it? Just to mention.
So the first time they talk about the coding of flows is in 1.4.
Right.
They begin by talking
Page
about
34.
the decoding of flows, and it's on page 34. And then they
Yeah,
also...
real quick, just can you say the sentence for me?
Yeah, I put it in the Discord. Sorry.
Right, say it.
Capitalism institutes or restores all sorts of residual and artificial, imaginary, or symbolic territorialities, thereby attempting, as best as it can, to recode.
There you go. That's, again, this isn't recoding, it's attempting as best it can. There's very particular language they use for this. Because it's not saying that it recodes, they're talking about the nature of the social order of meaning, or the Urstadt here, is attempting to recode. It's bringing these mythical, symbolical elements and these other territorialities is an attempt to recode, to rechannel persons who've been defined in terms of abstract. But this is the attempt to recode. It's not recoding though. Where's another time that they say it? Sorry, it's going to be. Apologies.
No, they don't. They don't like that. That's the thing I was saying earlier. They don't really say recoding too often throughout the text as much as they do reterritorialization.
Right, and there's a reason for that. So what?
So through the attempt to recode flows, though, that cannot assume that. I don't think that we ought to assume that that's like not doing anything in and of itself, though, because when we look at like. I don't know. I just think all throughout 1.4, especially when they talk about like the law of counteracted tendency by Marx and stuff like that, they're saying it's always trending towards a threshold of decoding, but it's also trending towards recoding too, right? So it's like there's two sides to this, because if capitalism produces the schizo and lets the schizo have free fucking reign, then that means that they'll surpass the limit of capital. There's no more capital. So it needs to be able to rein in the flows. It's like walking a dog on a leash. Like the dog can run around a little bit, but it needs to kind of come back. So maybe you're right, Brooks. It's not fully recoding flows, but at the same time, it's not fully decoding them either, right? It's tending towards a threshold or a limit. So if the schizophrenic is produced through this process of decoding or deterritorializing flows, what's recoding it? Is it Oedipus or family?
I just linked to the essay. It's a lecture he gave thank you everyone at Purdue. We love you all. That's been translated. So just to read a little bit. In any regime of code, what do we find? A code is never homogeneous. A code is made up of shreds, chunks, joined together piece by piece and piece by piece, crisscrossing a social field. Don't bother thinking in terms of linguistic homogeneity. A code borrows and mobilizes all sorts of signs. It mixes these signs together, and with this sort of multiplicity particular to code, a grid covers the social field by conjugating really diverse elements. Yet, in every code, there are secret zones bound up with whatever collective investments of organs, which is included in any code. I'm saying that the collectivity, the group, invests organs. It's what Paul Perrin demonstrates in his frustrating, awful book, blah, 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 French shit. He does a good job of demonstrating how, if there's any castration in so-called primitive societies, it comes from the mouth of cousins based on a collectively invested organ. I believe that these collective investment of organs is a fundamental aspect of code. In Levi-Strauss whatever. I'm not going to say anything right. I always apologize to French people or people who speak better. Levi-Strauss demonstrates the collective investment of organs and prohibitions. Like under particular circumstances, given particular conditions, you don't have a right to use particular organs, which certainly doesn't imply a defense or prohibition, but it does imply something positive regarding code, collective investment. This is one of Levi-Strauss's and then Godelier's take from him. It's worth reading on. All organs are coded or overcoded. You're not going to use your eyes in certain conditions. You're not going to see this. You won't use your nose, or on the other hand, you're called on after a system of initiation. An initiation means marking the body. What follows are instances of displacement. A mask cannot be understood as the very depiction of a collection of investment of organs. What I find interesting about a mask is the displacement between the organs and wearer and the organs represented on the mask. For example, those masks where the wearer doesn't see through the holes in the eyes but through some other orifice. What does it suggest? Well, it suggests this gap between one's own organs and organs taking on a new capacity. This whole regime of collectively investing organs implies zones that are necessarily secret. You're not in a position to make use of a collectively invested organ under such and such conditions. It requires a system of initiation to reach the point, blah, blah, blah. You can read the whole thing. The short version is codes are utilizing us, and as part of it, our meaning of it is direct. Capital doesn't do this. Capital doesn't have codes because it's not investing organs. Capital is investing capital. It's investing labor. It is labor. It is the end result. It doesn't give a shit about organs that are invested. It doesn't give a fuck about any of that. It doesn't even care if you're using a foot to hammer something or a hand. These things can be fungible. Everything is fungible because the pieces are what matter in capital. The personal, again, the segregation of the family and the personal to it means that necessarily we can't have everything coded in meaning, because there is no sort of singular place for this. There is no place to invest it because capital is distributed. So the family exists to create axiomatic understandings of the world, which are rule-based and other things. To just go back to the earlier part of the same thing, there are three machines, rather different interconnected aspects. One, a complex system of differential relationships between decoded and deterritorialized flux. This differential system doesn't replace one code with another or faulty territorialities with new territorialities. The first aspect of capitalist immanence is this kind of bookkeeping axiomatic, which consists in establishing differential relationships between decoded and deterritorialized flows as such. Two, if it's true that decoded flux as such, deterritorialized flux as such, have a specifically schizophrenic external limit, their limit is the schiz, the break. On the other hand, the differential between them wards off and resists this limit, substituting a set of internal limits that get reproduced on a wider and wider scale. This is why he uses the differential. That's the nature of it in calculus. It's a limit predictor is kind of how the differential works. The second aspect of capitalist immanence is the reproduction of the limits immanent to capital on an ever larger and increasing scale. Three, the general effusion of anti-production into the apparatus of production, to the point that in such a system, no productive activity can occur without attesting to its place in an apparatus of anti-production, a point that allowed us to distinguish between ancient imperial kinds of bureaucracy and modern bureaucracy, which serve to make the apparatus of anti-production permeate throughout all productive activity. These are the three parts of capitalist immanence as he talks about it. I linked it there. It's really fantastic as a reading.
Can you specify the bureaucracy aspect, because it's very interesting to me? Like, can you
how social order is determined is what he's talking about here. So the chief and the way that people hunt or do things in a prehistoric society is a bureaucracy. We don't really call it that often, but it is what it is. It's how people work together to get things done collectively. Within the despotic, it's the king and his bureaucracy, the priest and his perverts, as he calls them. But in capitalism, we have a much more striated bureaucracy of matrixed organizations and corporate structures and legal frameworks. And these things that sort of, again, the way that they operate is how we come together socially. My latest video went up this morning is on zoning laws and how they are just about the most important thing in the world, but they're exceptionally boring bureaucratic bullshit. And that's capitalism, is defining those rules, finding those places and setting them up. The three different types of bureaucracy is what they're talking about there.
So Mark's question, which phrases that the surplus value, which is, exists in circulation, but at the same time exists outside the circulation, right, of capital.
You might have to say that one more time.
Is there a gap? I mean, like Marx's famous question in Volume 1, when he said that capitalist or surplus value, right, which exists, in circulation, but at the same time outside the circulation, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have which the gap that I don't know, the gap between the X in Kantian I don't know, in Kantian terminology, right? Like what connect between them. I don't know. But like 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 it's kind of resembling that. I don't know,
Well,
but
just
the
I actually
mm,
from the same piece, and again I linked it in the chat. Um, Capitalist axiomatics offers us the only form of society what plays the role, functions as a full body, becomes a directly economic instance, something no code could ever withstand. It goes without saying that this is what grounds concealment. It must be hidden. The full body of such a society is directly economic. It's money capital. It's what all flux runs on. It's what productive forces are attributed to. In contrast to previous systems, there's no longer a difference in nature or timing between labor and surplus labor. In the worker's workday, it's impossible to distinguish, except abstractly in the form of an arithmetical difference, which allegedly belied the true nature of capitalism, the nature of its differential relations. It's impossible to find the line between labor and surplus labor, as opposed to what happens with despotic overcoding, where the part of labor and the part of surplus labor are qualitatively and temporally distinct.
yeah, that's a fair point. That's a
Happened to
fair
be
point.
from the
I
same
actually
seminar I had up. It's a really good seminar, by the way.
Yeah.
But that's the idea and again, just to read the difference between codes and axiomatics. In both codes and axiomatics, people aren't what gets marked. Code marks flows, flux. Only in primitive society, flux are marked according to how poorly developed productive forces are. Flux are marked based on organs. The fact that the flows, I'll just say flows, it's just easier, that flows are coded implies the collective investment of organs. This shows up with cultural relativists. The investment of organs is integral to coding flows. It motivates the whole system of prohibitions. I suppose such prohibitions are only a cover for some positive operation, this process of collectively investing organs. On the other hand, with capitalism, we've always said that it's built on the basis of a generalized decoding. Decoding doesn't attract flows without also affecting organs. Organs have gone through a fundamental collective disinvestment. The first organ to have been disinvested was the anus. This is the Max Weber setup. We can't ignore how African mythology illustrates that whenever organs get disinvested, organ codes, the coding of organs, lean towards the anus. The other organs followed. This collective disinvestment of organs is what we call castration. The anus is what's behind the main castration. The phallus, as a transcendent object, wouldn't exist if not for the anus. Oedipal is anal from top to bottom. It's a really long essay. This is good shit. Man, I could just, there's too much to read and make notes on. The point of the section, before we get to schizoanalysis, is understanding the critique they're making. That in Capital, it isn't that we are all social creatures and we're all made socially, blah, blah, blah. It's actually quite different. That, sure, we're social creatures. We can say that. It's a meaningless fucking phrase. But that the way that money circulates and how it necessarily has to, we find ourselves relating to people through that. Money, capital sets up our relationships. If you are, and we can go back in time, we can go now, but back in time, who made money, who wasn't allowed to work? Those people related to society through the person who could. And now, mom and dad, both men and women are able to work. It can be mom, dad, doesn't matter. Kids, not able to work. Not advocating child fucking labor. Don't be weird on me now. But their relationship to society is through those who have capital. They have to relate to those people in ways that are sort of not spoken. No parent ever says to their child, well, actually parents fucking do. Well, you don't say to young, well, maybe some do. Do what I say or I'm throwing you out of the fucking house. That happens when they're later. But do you think 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds don't have an understanding of that in some capacity, or that it wasn't intimated in some way, that the relation... Yeah, go for it.
Put in a few phrases here. It's not just children, immigrants too.
Oh my God, yes. Well, and this is where you start seeing how this gets applied is our relationship in this way. When you hear conservatives talk about immigrants, especially illegal immigrants, this is our house. They don't belong here. They say shit like that. It's nobody's fucking house. It's a fucking...
We don't have to go there. We don't have to go there. I'm just mentioning because, I'm an international student. That's it. We don't have to go to politics.
I like going. I think politics is fun for this because you can start seeing how people relate it. And again, this isn't me saying, this is the important one, is I'm not saying that is like bad. They're bad people. I think it's shitty, but that's not the point. The way that people are produced in capital creates this system, creates this setup that reinforces itself. This is the nature of material production falling back on itself. And that's the point of the entire thing. Hope that makes sense.
We can talk more about that later.
Yeah, we will.
This relates to a question I was going to ask, that the way that people are produced in capitalism, right? And then you juxtapose that to in capitalism doesn't care anymore about the family, right? So it's sort of, it's sort of separated off from social processes, but nevertheless, it's still produced socially, right? So there's a distinction there, right? Between a kind of, I may not be articulating this well, but between a kind of fundamental social production within capitalism that produces the family as something separate from capital.
And that's, the idea of, so I may have you restate it again just so I can make sure that I'm understanding. But the big point they've got is that the creation of the subject prior to capital was social. We were made socially. We were built socially. Our subjectivity, our subject, king and subject as a term was sort of determined that way. Now it's formed in family, and it's done with the same tools that it was done before, but now privately, symbolically, and then unleashed on the rest of the social field with the investments and the understanding of that.
But so the symbolic and the private themselves are produced on the basis of something which is collective.
Yes, but paralogistically, like all of it's desire.
Meaning,
again, none of this is not desire. All of this is desire. Social machines and the social world is desire under contingent conditions. So it's particular time and space actualization of desire is the social machine. But it doesn't mean it's not paralogistic. It doesn't mean it follows the sort of logic of desire. It's bending it, it's breaking it, it's making it see things and build things and set things up and invest in images that are prohibitive and structured in a way that create a symbolic understanding of the world where we see repetition where there isn't, where we see the same even if it's not, where we see mom and dad everywhere and reduce everything to this very simple set of interactions, man, woman, child, for example, at the basic, but everything else can be just found the same way. That's the setup.
I guess what I'm trying to do is take this back to sort of the genius of Deleuze and Guattari in the first place, which is to marry a Freudian concept and a Marxist concept. The Freudian concept of libido on the one hand, and the Marxist concept of production. And so there. In a certain sense, the social. I think I'm getting hung up on using the word social and maybe not refining it enough. But I want to be able to say, in a fundamental sense, the social is never absent in any aspect.
Let me try.
Okay.
I think I can do this. I think I can do this.
Okay.
I think I can do this. All right. Capital determines what gets made where, what factory is building what thing. Actual setup. Capital determines these things. Now, if we were to take the libertarian paradise version of things, why does capital determine? Well, the market decides where things go. It needs it here. It needs it there. Wants this here. The market supposedly wants these things and sets them up. But that's not the logic of capital. It's not actually how capital works, because capital can become concentrated. Capital can become so concentrated that laws of supply and demand become meaningless and instead become perverted. These very, very big setups that are happening that is literally like the critique of Marx at a basic level of what capitalism's inner autocritique is about that. It's, hey, here's how capital works. Like how I read Marx and Capital, even with the new edition, has always been this, that Marx is basically just laying out the workings of capital. He's not even saying like, this is why it's evil. He's just saying, here's how it works. And by the way, it concentrates, and over time it does this, and here's how it goes. And it falls back on itself. And slowly we have these weird pockets of concentration that misshape the marketplace. Suddenly it's not so much that all the people are creating sort of like this democratized idea of capital, where they're distributing desire and needs everywhere, or capital needs, or investment, or whatever it is. But what happens is those pockets, those concentrations, warp how capital functions. It concentrates more of itself. You end up becoming someone who can charge as much as you want and pay as little as you want. And it's no longer market forces. It's perverted, as like a hardline capitalist, an Alan Greenspan type would say. This has become perverted. The rules of capital and how it functions creates that. This is not far. If we were to take that idea of labor, his critique was like, well, wait, look at labor. Because it's not really capital that runs things, it's labor. And capital fucks with labor. And capital takes labor, excess amounts of it, and captures it like fucking vampires. And it dies until it's used somewhere else to create more living capital that, again, is going. This is how capital builds itself. But it's not capital doing it, it's labor doing it. Labor is actually the function at the center of production that capital is falling back on. And they go, labor? No, 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 no. It's not labor, it's desire. Desire is actually at the basis of all labor, which is at the basis of all capital. There, yeah? No?
It sounds good. I'm thinking this over.
Yeah, no, it's... Marx looked at capital and said, it's not the money, it's not the capital that determines what gets built, like the Elon Musk or the libertarians believe. He went, no, it's labor. Men labor, and here's how it's utilized. And here's the logic of how labor progresses. That's what capital is. That's across the board. Capital is a logic of labor as an abstraction. And he does a phenomenal job of it, like deeply phenomenal job. Because it's not really, it's only called capital because it's a critique of it through labor. In my eyes, I'm not a Marxist master. I'm not perfect, but just so reading, I think it's a good reading of it. And he went, actually, it's what you notice, and it's a big one, is you can't, my favorite line in the world, you can't tell who grew the wheat by eating bread. It's not a thing. The process of the whole thing, well, you have a bunch of bread at the end, doesn't determine or set up anything. You have no knowledge of it before then, because that middle process is so fucked up that it inverts, it changes material reality, and actually the labor interaction with material conditions produces this other setup that we see this as this after image of capital. That thing that Marx is critiquing by saying, look, this industry doesn't exist because some capitalist put it there. It's there because labor came in, did things, a capitalist extracted and fell back on it. And they go, Marx was fucking right, but he didn't go far enough. He was kind of a big pussy. He should realize that you are a factory and you don't exist any more than those factories do. And your output, you've mistaken in the same exact way. You and your wants, your needs, your hopes, your thoughts, your subjectivity, that end process that's being made, you've forgotten that there's wheat farmers at the very, very beginning that are trying to do their goddamn best, but you're the capitalist of your own existence that has completely fucked everything up because you're not obeying and understanding the rules and logic of desire. Same thing.
Mm.
But it is following the rules and logic of desire, because that's what's happening.
They're paralogisms. There's a difference.
Yeah, I think you're making a great point here, Brooks, and I love the tie back to what, like the first page of Das Kapital that D&G do with that wheat example. I think that's one of my favorites. I think I'll just point out one thing here for Josh's too. I think we're still making a distinction between social and desiring production. So I'd just be a little careful by saying like social processes are somehow divorced from the family, or the family is divorced from some socius, or something along those lines of the way the question was going. I mean, the desire is innately social. That's just what it is. Desire and production is social production.
So
they say that.
I know, but I'm going to make an edge. So it's all about how we communicate these things. It's one of the things that's very, very difficult because there's a contingency and a way of speaking through all this. And so when we talk about they said this, one, they never spoke in English, so they probably never said those words. Two, even if they said those words in French and it's a proper translation, they said them under very particular context. So desire, everything is desire. Just like capital is labor. That's how I would compare it. There's no capital without labor. It doesn't exist that way. There's no social
capital,
that isn't also
capital
desire.
isn't labor. It's a surface.
Capital
is a surface that is born. No, it's born from two decoded flows. You have the decoded flows of labor, but you also have the decoded flows of money capital, right? Like you have to have the decoded flow of production and then the decoded flow of labor. So you have, production in the form of money capital, and then production, and then the decoded flow of labor in the form of
it's an abstraction of the concretization of labor that then is used to then reinvigorate and be reinvigorated by other labor.
I don't know what you mean by reinvigorated by other labor. I mean, for them, they're saying
made living.
Like decoded flows of labor just means like my body can now go anywhere in the fucking world and work and generate surplus, right? Like
yes, you can always become and you can always work in a sweatshop, absolutely everywhere. Because again, deterritorialized, reterritorialized within capital at the same time, these two kind of go together, right? So when we're talking about capital, and this is Klosowski's Living Currency. I'm reading it right now with President Sunday on his fucking channel. Highly recommended for everyone. The PDF somewhere around. I'll repost it for the 1,000th time in this chat. But they talk about capital as being explicitly desire made action and then captured by a concretized quantification process that then is dead and then reattaches as if a vampire and feeds off of other labor in order to come back to life. You take capital doesn't do anything itself. It does nothing. It's just a quantity that's abstracted. By adding it to 5 men and a building, you actually can refire it back up, and that capital then becomes and use labor again, which then can generate surplus once more. And then once again, you have more if you do it right. You have less if you do it wrong. And out you come the other side. So it is very much that. Desire, in the same way all of that is labor, desire is labor socially. When you have a quantified specific event that happens, I'm talking to you right now, that thing is quantified. It isn't desire, not in that sense of like it's a living, breathing, pulsating thing. The word's now recorded and in the past someone else can be watching it. But it is desire because it is a contingent social connection of multiple desiring machines. This is a much more larger, complex thing, but it's particular. The reason I mention it is because when we talk about how we equate Marx or with this, they're very explicit early on. For them, they want to talk about the unconscious like a series of factories, like the subject is the capitalist. And they want to reformulate Marx to be thinking about not labor as an abstract quality that is sort of, oh, it's over here, and then there's capital, and then there's me, and then there's mom. It's like, no. Desire's the baseline. It bubbles up through an individual, through your subjectivity that is formed thanks to mom and dad, privatized experiences that discipline and give you the symbolic setup that you need. And then you're out into the world where desire is already investing in everything as it always was because of all the symbolic connections. But all of these things are paralogisms that grant you phantasms of ego, phantasms of whole bodies, mom or dad, as if there were proper names or singular, when in reality we're talking about maybe both at the same time, and it fucks language up. This is why language is fucked up. So this creates the same problem as we're discussing it that they're talking about, because we're not talking about desire. I'm talking about words. We're using words to try to convey concepts. And again, I'm pointing at the word desire on a sign, and the goal is not to mistake my finger for the moon I'm pointing at, more or less.
Like the word the elephant, right? It kind of like generate like like Lacan talked about the elephant and how to generate multiple things. Even like we learn the word the elephant as a children before we encounter an elephant, right? Like before we encounter or see an elephant, right?
Yep.
Which is a fascinating thing, actually. Think about it, Brooks, right?
Yes.
Like we learn the word elephant and we don't understand it, right?
No,
It's kind
and
of
we're taught to think of things as this is what a thing is symbolically, and then everything matches to that. It's a Platonist ideal system. My mom is the sort of archetypical mom for me. My dad is the archetypical dad, but Randy and Judy are just fucking people that were holding that position, but they had to relate to me in particular ways as I was growing and taught me discipline and self-discipline and control in the ways that they did. So in that way, I came out a Randy Judy combination of person who's visiting now their own primary and secondary repression socially on themselves, along with all of you who have all kinds of fucked up stuff too. I'm not alone in this. So it's super fun, isn't it?
yeah, it's super fun. Actually, like Adam Smith said, like, and then in conclusion, Adam Smith said, like capital is the command of labor. Marx said that like capital is the command of labor and unpaid labor. And I guess the conclusion is that capitalism is the command of labor and unpaid labor and the command of desire, I guess. And that's my conclusion, you know. I'm sure that's a narrow conclusion, but that's
Yeah, I think
yeah.
I think I found a better way to articulate what I was getting at, and I think that it can be found in the distinction that they make between subject groups and subjected groups.
We're up.
So in the one,
We will get there. Just everyone be ready. I'm going to let you finish, but I'm just going to do like my little Brooks alert. Hey, if you don't recognize those words, that's okay. We're not there yet. This man is apparently a rabbit and a frog, and he's jumping ahead, which is perfectly fine. So please continue.
Okay. Well, let's see if I could translate it in terms that we have encountered already. Well, collectivities. There are different kinds of collectivities, you know. And according to one collectivity would be that which is found in, you know, the primary productions of desire. And that's collective. And then there's, you know, the collectivity on the basis of which you can make a distinction between persons that are being repressed. You know, in other words, where you have
I might be able to make it simpler than this.
Okay.
It's something I think everyone here, most of us are terminally online in one capacity or another, but you can pick a pop culture thing. And at some point in your life, something you liked, and then something that you found yourself identifying with. There's a difference. People who, hey, you know, Star Wars is a good movie. So that's pretty cool. I am a Star Wars fan. That difference. There is a subject group or a subjugated group. People who come to the QC, every person who comes here, I don't think anyone, maybe I shouldn't say anyone, but chances are most people didn't come here and going, excellent, this is where I belong. It's not the first thing. It's not why you like looking for places I belong called the QC. You show up and you're like, oh, I like this. Over time, and especially some of us, myself and others in the moderator staff, you identify yourself as someone who's here in this place, part of this group. There's a shifting that happens where you start changing yourself for the group, subject versus subjugated. This change you see in revolutionary movements across the board. The Russian Revolution is the one that they are going to use as a great example of this. Same with the French. There's a lot of really the orange, which I love just saying as a thing if you haven't looked it up. The subject versus subjugated groups, this is the process.
Last stop? Okay. I thought there's another step ahead of us.
Well, could you connect that to how capitalism produces this notion of the family as being split off from the social? Wouldn't that be one particular example of how subjugation works?
It's not that it produces a family as split off from the social intentionally. It's not like an intentional thing. Capitalism doesn't give a fuck about subjectivity. And we have to have subjects in a state-based society. We have to have subjects. You need to be a citizen. You need to fit in. These things are part of the archaistic bullshit that has been left over from a long period of time. If you look back, there's a few countries and states that have existed. We're in those. We exist only in that historical reality. So as that stuff mutates and as capitalism does away with everything it does, the need to make sure that we have a subject, the need that we have to make sure that people fit in, especially as we have a terror around economics and economic safety and survival, this collision of all of these things continues to produce a mini state of the family. And that state is its own thing, but also miniature. And so we have, it's why the state is the one who actually licenses and says rights around what you can do or what a family is, how many parents, who can live together, what it means, they can take your children from you. These are state regulations. Capitalism doesn't really care. No, it's not its thing. But what it needs to continue to function is subjects, subjugated subjects particularly. And so you have this working very well, bad shit that works very well within capitalism. So capitalism is fine to have it. It doesn't give a fuck. It doesn't give a fuck about the family. It just is working. So it's going to keep doing that thing.
So it can't. So capitalism can't be said to have a repressive role on the desire of
capitalism
of
can.
the family.
The capital economic sort of, again, pieces. It's all pieces. Capitalism as a whole is the whole body of the capitalist, the whole body of capitalism, all of these things. This is a large, gigantic system. You can absolutely blame a large, gigantic system and talk about the structures and things that exist. Mm-hmm. Could we get rid of the family? Well, what would that mean? Like, quite literally, it's a really odd thought example. The Expanse is a great sci-fi series that really goes to like the extremes of what it means to get rid of the family in sort of this weird neo-capitalist world where like everyone lives in communes, and he has the main character has like 8 moms, but one was the one he cared most about. Like, it's really weird, but they explore that thing that exists is, I think, the point is like, all of this is a system. We're all produced in this entire thing. There's no like extricating one part from another. There's no clear lines delineating. This isn't the place where we have a king, we depose the king and we start a democracy. And so we switch from a despotic to a capitalist. It's not really how it works. Things aren't that clear cut and set up. So you've got to kind of keep working around these things and how they're set up. It's really fascinating. And Noah grabs the section I'm kind of referencing a bit here. We maintain it both does and does not have an exterior limit. It has an exterior limit that is schizophrenia, that is the absolute decoding of flux, but it functions only by pushing back and exercising this limit. It also has and does not have interior limits. And again, this is the thing they're talking about, as he says here. Capitalism is treading both towards decoding and recoding flux, but it never has the capacity to get there completely. And so it has this reterritorialization and process that's being handled by ultimately us, the family, the state, and these other things as the axiomatic kind of plays its role.
Brooks, I think that you pointing out the fact that it's attempting these has kind of changed the way that I view it, because before I was kind of looking at it almost teleologically, like an end thing, like capitalism is doing it, right? It's successfully recoded, but it's always this process that continues to kick the can down the road, right? Because I think if you view it as that type of end goal, you're going to fall into the trap that Marx does, thinking that kind of contradictions are going to lead to the end.
It's a pulsing and growing, like a spore mushroom kind of thing, where it's like pulse kind of thing as it's going. And there's a lot of language they use that's completely fucked up. Like Cowboy and Xanax has the line, I thought capital equals the BW of capitalism. It is not. That is a thing that they say, and then I think they literally say, sorry that they said that. Like, it's this really weird way that they phrase it, because capital is the socius, which is like the BWO of capitalism, but it's not. The socius doesn't operate like a BWO. It's a whole other thing because it's a social order of elements. So it's a whole thing. I know you say that, but again, if you reread it, do you want me to go back? We'll do this right now. Come on, Noah.
Oh no, I'm not. I think that it's a very nuanced take. I'm just saying that it's in 1.1. I think
it's in 1.1, and then they go beyond that.
I
They go
think it's
beyond
very
that for a reason.
Right, especially in 1.2, they're going to say, actually, you know, capital is a surface, right, and of social production writ large, not just the capitalist being. To be very clear, I think that they're being a little elusive there.
One sec, I just need to find the fucking where it's said. Ugh. Yeah. So it's not. So just to be very particular, capital is indeed the body without organs of the capitalist, or rather the capitalist being. It's not capitalism. So the existence of someone who is a capitalist, their BWO would be capital. They're not saying capital is the BWO of capitalism. Very particular meaning.
Could you rephrase that?
Yes. Maybe I can. Give me a second.
Okay.
I'm just going to read the paragraph. As Marx observes, in the beginning, capitalists are necessarily conscious of the opposition between capital and labor, and of the use of capital as a means of extorting surplus labor. But a perverted, bewitched world quickly comes into being as capital increasingly plays the role of a recording service that falls back on all of production, furnishing and realizing surplus value is what establishes recording rights. Quote, with the development of relative surplus value in the actual specifically capitalist mode of production, whereby the productive powers of social labor are developed, these productive powers and the social interrelations of labor in the direct labor process seem transferred from labor to capital. Capital thus becomes a very mystic being, since all of labor's social productive forces appear to be due to capital, rather than labor as such, and seem to issue from the womb of capital itself. What is specifically capitalist here, that's the end of the quote, is the role of money and the use of capital as a full body to constitute the recording and inscribing surface, but some kind of full body, that of the earth or the despot, a recording surface, an apparent objective movement, a fetishistic, perverted, bewitched world are characteristics of all types of society of constant social reproduction. So capital specifically is the capitalist, and so when we say capitalist, it's we're talking about, again, it's almost a symbolic point or position, the same as the despot. The capitalist takes capital and invests it in businesses, and then it produces their recording surface. Again, not as a whole being, just as a capitalist, just that one part of the menagerie which they are. But that thing that is the capitalist is someone who the capital is their BWO. It is the recording surface on which things are written. But that's only the capitalist being, not capitalism, which is a larger giant social machine.
Within the workhouse, right? You
Say
find
again?
the capitalist. Within the workhouse, right? The workhouse.
Within
the
an investment
factory
bank.
machinery.
Within the investment bank,
Okay.
the capitalist moment, or the investor, or the guy who owns the company, or the whoever it is, the banker, not the guy at the front, or not the guy who, oh, I like capitalism. That's not what a capitalist is. A capitalist is a person who is investing capital, and through capital produces capital. Their BW, the recording surface of of that side of things, is capital. Okay. You and I and humans, the human subjectivity, the subject that exists, the BWO is our recording surface. It is the body without organs. If I removed all of your productive organs, what would be left of you? That's the idea of what a BWO is. It's literally a body without production. And what's left is the odd organization of sensations and things that have sort of been left to memory that you actually springboard off of every single day, depending on is literally how you're reacting to my voice being confident or not, or how I have pink fingernails or blue eyes or white skin, emotional reactions to everything you're seeing, literally everything. All of these are desiring machines firing off of and reacting to the BWO, and your reactions are that. This is your thing. The capitalist, not the person, but the capitalist being, this is what capital does for them.
The capitalist being sorry, the capitalist being in what way?
Well, that's what the idea of what is a
Sorry.
capitalist? The capitalist. There's no such thing in the way D&G talk about stuff as totalizing someone. So, like, if I were to say, for example, let's talk about the despot. If I were to talk about Caesar as the despot, and I say, look, the despot's position is X, Y, or Z. One, I'm talking about the despot. I'm not talking about Caesar. I may be talking about Caesar when he's being a despot or when he's with a despotic being, right? But I'm not talking about Caesar the person. I'm talking about what it means to be a despot. If I were to talk about black people, white people, the white man, the black woman, the trans man, the trans woman, I'm not talking about any person. I'm talking about kind of their being, that being of that part that kind of flattens the rest of them and shits on the rest of everything. And that's kind of their point, is capital is indeed the body without organs of the capitalist, or rather the capitalist being. But as such, it is not only the fluid and petrified substance of the money, for it will give to the sterility of money the form whereby money produces money. It produces surplus value. This is the thing that it does. And this is to just rewind to the previous paragraph. All production constituting, it falls back, the BWO falls back on all production constituting a surface over which forces and agents of production are distributed, thereby appropriating for itself all surplus production and arrogating to itself both the whole and parts of the process, which now seem to emanate from it as quasi-cause. I'll pause there. If I were to say that ancient tribes believed the earth gave them everything, it's the quasi-cause. They care about the earth. They dig in the earth. The earth, they see animals come from it and around it. The earth takes all credit. They're the ones doing shit. Their labor's the thing, but the earth gets the credit. The despot, the king, all is done for the king. Glory to the king. The king is the reason that you do everything, not the dude, the one dude. Maybe it's the dude, but you're looking at the dude. It's more a symbol. It's the king. It's the king, the despot. Capital, you'll hear people say this. Look, we just need more capital. That will give us time, room to hire more people, which is as backwards ass as anything that exists in the world. If anyone here is ever wanting to take a business class, Business 101 is that if you can, you will hire more people because you hire people to make more money. You don't have extra money and spend it on people. It's not how it works. That's backwards. But this is how Peter Thiel and Musk and all these people talk, whether knowingly or not. Doesn't even matter, but they talk about capital as if it creates jobs. Yeah. That's insane. But it is the quasi-cause. It is the position from the capitalist. It is the quasi-cause of all creation and all investment in all things.
Bingo, that's commodity fetishism right there, right? Rather than looking at the fucking object as like having some, magical quantity or quality emanating from it. It's now the surface. And the surface of capital emanates from it. I like to think about it as like, if you have like a little money in your savings or whatever, and you get like a little dividend, it's like, wow, there's something magical. Like I didn't even have to work. It's just constantly going up. There's always this surplus going up, which makes the system look magical. It makes capitalism or the surface of capital look like there's something there that's magical, which continues, to kind of bewitch. I think that's the word that they use in French too. It bewitches us in that way. So they're really taking it that far.
Love it. And we have a comment. The category theory is a note, and I'm going to be tapping out because that's we're now hitting 3 hours 15 minutes. My throat is giving out on me. I'm just not a pro like I used to be when I walked the streets in the evenings. But if you get a chance, we have a lovely guy, Kent, who's part of the server. He's actually written a ton on category theory. If you go look him up, you'll find a lot of his stuff. It's pretty fantastic. But with that, next week, I'll probably do a poll about this sometime midweek and try to figure out. But next week, either I'm doing a recap of all of 3, which I feel like I don't want to do. Just because it's been now 5 or 6 months. I think we've been on 3, which is good. It's the hardest section of the book, to be frank, in my opinion. I think I'd like to move on to 4. If it does, whatever, we're doing one of those 2 things. Recapitulation of 3 or moving forward to 4, praxis in schizoanalysis and actually beating up on ideas and talking through what can actually be done to make the world a better place and not shitty. Oh, thank you, Simone. Best theory on YouTube. I agree. I don't agree, but I agree. So with that, I thank you all. I'm going to send you off on YouTube. I'm going to send you off to Shakespeare, so you can do that. Give my best to the Shakespeare.